call. Councilmember Polito,
Here.
Councilmember Hawkins,
Here.
Councilmember Lewis,
Here.
Vice Mayor Whitmer, and Mayor DeGolia.
Yes, I'm here. And Anthony, would you make a comment about public comment?
Certainly. So in light of the fact that we have a good room full of folks, and I know that everybody would like to probably make some comments, we have a couple of options for you. For one, you could fill out this speaker card, give it to me, and we can go in that order. But we just want to remind everyone to be mindful of the 3-minute timer. I'm going to run it. I'll give you a little 1-minute note, and then we do it very respectfully. But if you could just keep that in mind, that would be great. And other than that, it's all yours.
And if you're online, you can click on the reactions button on the bottom of your page and just raise your hand. And then we'll know that you want to give a public comment. And I will open the floor to public comments. This is for comments for items on the agenda, since this is a special meeting. And I'll also take public comments when we get into the item. So after the council's first addressed it, if you wish to give your public comment, then you can, or if you wish to give it now, be fine. But just please state your name and your address whenever you give a public comment.
Hear me now? Thank you. My name's Tom Georgie, and I'm here with Stephanie Sargent, 425 East Oakwood, Redwood City, East Oakwood Boulevard. We read the recommendation from staff to add multifamily zoning onto private property as a strategy for getting an approved housing element. Especially the proposed density at 23 Oakwood is an idea I believe this council should reject. You have heard me make emotional pleas before, so I'm going to try to balance out my approach and be a little rational here. Nobody wants this. Nobody wants this. You don't want it, except the Aradas want it. And I've heard from every neighbor surrounding the property. There's 6 of them. Us, 437 East Oakwood, Zhao Chen, Lou, and Olivia. They don't want it. 435 East Oakwood, Luis Belenko and Stephanie Chenevey. They don't want it. With them, we're coordinating a neighborhood group. Further our fight against this. 63 Sabalo Lane in Atherton. This is an Atherton resident. Don and Alberto Del Nevo. They don't want this. 15 Oakwood Boulevard in Atherton, Eric Yip. Haven't spoke to him personally. Zhao Chen did. He doesn't want it. 28 Selby Lane, Atherton, owned by RCR Residence LLC. Katie Snow, the house manager. She's commented publicly their opposition to this project. And their opposition is because of the privacy concerns of the owner of that property. In addition to these 6 surrounding properties, every single neighbor, and I've spoken with scores in the Oakwood neighborhood, is against it. Nobody in favor. The property is 1.52 acres, not 1.62. Every map I've seen is 1.52. Where's the due diligence on that? It affects the unit count. Also, a significant portion of the 23 Oakwood property is actually in Redwood City, about 6 to 10 feet. I've spoken with Kaya Eakin and Diane Howard, Redwood City Council. Diane Howard, she publicly commented to this chamber also her concerns given the disparity of density in Redwood City where this project abuts. The town has other options to consider for smoothing the path to an approved housing element. They don't need to include Oakwood. If you need 32 units, Holbrook Park's not even being considered. Bear Gulch, per staff, 2 sites, 40 to 60 units each is what it can support. 2 sites, 40 to 60 units. That's 80 to 120 units. And they're only proposing that they consider planning for 20. There's a disconnect. Let's take 32 units out of my family's sanctuary and put them up on Bear Gulch, because there you could control how much is low income. And in at Oakwood, Arata is going to do the bare minimum, only what the city's going to put in the ordinance, an inclusionary ordinance that 20% have to be low income. So please do not add back multifamily housing on private property to the housing element. Shift the burden to the properties the town controls. If anything, it's appropriately symbolic that the town should carry the burden to do the required density on property that they control, instead of forcing the unlucky neighbors of 23 Oakwood to be the sacrificial lambs of the periphery. Thank you.
Is there any other public comment?
My name is Kaya Aiken. I am a member of the Redwood City Council in District 5. District 5 is part of the subject property on the border. I would ask you to give us notice of at all times, and I believe now that I am on the listserv and will get notice. This is a part of Redwood City that has flooding problems, traffic problems. Parts of this neighborhood, which is the Oakwood neighborhood, have historically had underserved structural problems. And the traffic imposition of this drastic increase in density should be borne by the city of Atherton, not the city of Redwood City. The city of Redwood City exceeds the housing requirements, and we're not in a position to take on your traffic and your infrastructure problems. But you know what? I'm just thrilled to be here. Thank you for your service, all of you here. I really look forward. Rick, you sent me such a nice email yesterday. I'm really looking forward actually to partnering with all of you. And we're going to do best practices, and we are going to work hard together. And I'm happy to meet all of you. That's it. And now you know how to get a hold of me. I'm sure we'll be meeting many more times. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other public comment? Please.
Hi, Rod Shepard. I live at 398 Walsh Road. And thank you again for allowing me to speak today. Rather than speaking on a specific proposal or project or element of the staff report, I wanted to give you some of the thoughts that I've had recently. And one is that you guys have been tasked with an impossible job. The state has these mandates and have provided really no meaningful way for you to accomplish what they would like to be accomplished. So the question for us is, how do we move forward? And how do we meet the letter of the law and yet maintain what the market says is the most desirable place in the United States to live? So with that, I've given it some thought. And one of the things that I noticed in the law was that the state has given you two options. Number one, you can have the state certify your housing element. And it's in the code. It's pretty clear on the government section. The other option they've given you is you can certify your housing element. And you do that by doing what you've done for the last year. And then you come up with findings, and you make sure that the findings that you have developed match the law that they've given you. They may not match what the bureaucrat in Sacramento has given you, but they need to match what the law has given you. So the idea would be, and I think when you submitted back in August, on August 2nd, a housing element, you thought it matched the law. And you probably still think it matches the law. So why not continue on with that, certify that on January 31st. That protects you probably from any builder's remedy because you now have a certified housing element. And you can move forward with sort of the longer term discussions that the town needs to have in Atherton about how we address some of these issues that the state has brought forward to us. So, and my suggestion there is you have a town that for 99 years has had a very clear #1 goal that says no high density of any kind, commercial, residential, no high density. This process has forced you to address that, but not philosophically, not systematically with the community. And so you haven't gone out to the community and gotten guiding principles that you really need if you're going to replace that kind of statement. So I would suggest that you have a certified element on January 31st. And then in the course of the next year, you develop what should the guiding principles for higher density housing be if in fact we are going to have higher density housing in Atherton? At that point, then we can come back and revisit it. But to go ahead and rezone this property today, or that property today, or this property today, you're doing it on an ad hoc basis in the most thoughtful way you can do now, but not in a globally thoughtful way. So I really encourage you to consider developing a strategy that allows you to develop a guiding principle. Maybe it's a principle such as any high density housing should be along a transit corridor, near services, and not near schools, or however you in the community decide to identify it. But I strongly encourage you, because I find decision-making in response to edicts and done quickly end up with bad decisions. And so that's my hope, is that we can find a way through this that allows, and I would encourage you to direct staff to come up with findings that support the documentation that we have and are comfortable with, have our attorneys provide support so that we can have a fully defensible certification. So thank you. Those are my thoughts today.
Okay, thank you, Rod. Okay, Scott?
My name is Scott Wiley, 22 Oakwood Boulevard, Atherton. My property is across the street from 23 Oakwood Boulevard, which is being considered by the town for rezoning as a site for 32 multi-family homes. I'd first like to point out that Oakwood Boulevard, the property in question, 23 Oakwood Boulevard, is not located at the end of Oakwood Drive, as referenced in the staff report. Oakwood Drive is a Redwood City street that connects residential Redwood City with El Camino. Oakwood Boulevard, the street in question, is a small, narrow residential street that stretches from Selby Lane to the town's border with Redwood City. The street does not have immediate access to El Camino or to public transportation. We are already experiencing cut-through traffic, which will substantially increase with the town's proposed elimination of left turn traffic from Selby on to El Camino. 32 townhomes would negatively, permanently, and unnecessarily impact our residential street. We strongly urge the council to remove 23 Oakwood from the draft housing element.
Okay, thank you, Scott. Is there any other public comment? I don't see any in the room, none online. Okay, but
I just wanted to know.
if you're gonna get, you need to speak.
That's right. My name is Jeanette Goodman and I live at 99 Reservoir Road, right across from the water company. I am not clear in my mind where exactly these low-income houses are going to be placed on that property. They own a lot of property. I don't know if it's the intention of it is to keep it on our side of Atherton or on the side of Moore Road and Woodside Road. I don't know if their property stretches out that far, but it would seem to me that anything that's going to be built should be built over in that area and have no entrance or exit to Reservoir and Walsh Road. As it is, we have tremendous traffic from the water company every day. I am on the police patrol from Atherton and I walk in that area frequently. And there are trucks constantly coming from the water company. So if we had any more traffic there, it would be detrimental to everybody who lives in the area. I just would like to clarify this, please.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor and members of the council. You have staff, sorry.
Go up to the mic. Do you want to give public comment, Jack? Do you want to give public comment? Okay.
I'm Jack Ringham, live on Fair Oaks Lane. I've been in Atherton for over 57 years. And I like living here. But I think I and others like me that have been here a long time find that maintaining a big house and a big yard is becoming increasingly difficult. So I would suggest that the town consider studying the issue of whether to allow senior living facilities and senior care facilities within the town limits. This would not only permit people that like living here, but are forced to move out to get into the kind of facility that they can, that'll accommodate them. So we can let those people still live here. And it'll also probably tend to increase our population, which is gradually sinking. So I hope the council will give some consideration and perhaps appoint a subcommittee to explore the feasibility of providing some kind of senior living protection.
Okay, thank you, Jack. And I think we have a comment online.
Hi, my name is Stephanie Corey. I live on Roble Ave. I'm right on the border of Redwood City and Atherton, and I'm the co-chair for the Redwood Oaks neighborhood. Like Kaya, I just found out about this meeting. We weren't notified about it, but luckily was able to attend. And I just want to put on the record that I am very much opposed to building these multifamily homes in these residential areas. I think I can safely speak for our neighborhood because people in our neighborhood have voiced their concern to me after I sent a message to them. I received multiple replies back saying that, that they were not happy with this. As Kaya said, our neighborhood streets are extremely narrow. We've been dealing with being underfunded, basically, not having sidewalks, having extremely narrowed streets, having parking problems galore, and water issues. We're slightly lower than Atherton, and the water drains into our city, and it's created massive problems for all of us. Having multifamily homes without having the proper infrastructure, not next to any public transit, not next to any really city services, is just not going to work for us. And so I just want that on the record that everybody who voiced their concern to me, which was about 15 different people and myself, and we are not happy about this.
Okay, thank you, Stephanie. Thank you, Stephanie. Is there any other public comment? Okay, I'm not seeing any more public comment. We'll go ahead with the staff report.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Members of the council, you have the staff consultant team here to answer questions, but I'll be giving the bulk of the staff report this evening. But before I launch into that, first, I wanted to address the Cowwater Bear Gulch issue for those in the room or on the line in Zoom. The town has received a formal letter from Cowwater requesting that their site be removed from consideration of development at 20 units per acre. And while they have a need for 2 to 4 caretaker housing units, the reality of that occurring, given their other priorities, is more of an idea than a potential. So they would like that removed as well. They would support only a statement that advises that they do not anticipate that they will develop new housing units during this housing element cycle, similar to what is stated for Sacred Heart. As such, staff recommends that the 20 units that are identified for Bear Gulch site be removed, and that includes the removal of those 4 caretaker houses. That will require, as we go through this process, that we identify an additional 10 units within the very low and low income category for development somewhere else in town. And I believe Don Smithson is here from Cowwater if the council has any particular questions on that issue before I go forward. Hearing none. Okay. So for small jurisdictions with limited opportunities for affordable housing development, the 23 to 31 RHNA requirements are a little bit onerous. The tools and resources that are available to the traditional community, such as Redwood City, Menlo Park, East Palo Alto, and others, are not available here. We don't have the benefit of any community development block grant funds that foster and fund the development of affordable housing. We don't have any land of significance owned outright by the town, aside from where our City Hall, Public Library, and Police Department now sit. The standout singular property owned by the town is the town's one and only park, which is restricted to a significant degree via a land entitlement restriction that prohibits that sort of development. That makes it very difficult for the town to use town-owned land to create subsidized opportunities for affordable housing. Purchasing land in town, as we know, comes at a price point that makes it difficult for any multifamily development to really attain an affordability target. There are no commercial or industrial properties in town. All of these challenges, all of this challenges the town's ability to provide fiscal incentive for land uses that support affordable housing and limits the availability and walkable accessibility of resources to residents that might live in that housing, should it exist at all. But we are doing our best to designate sites that are suitable for affordable housing and the development of housing opportunities. The state mandate still applies. The RHNA housing allocation for the town is higher than it has ever been, and we are required to develop a plan for that housing at all income levels and how it might be developed over the next 8 years. That plan must be accepted and approved by the state, or as Rod Shepherd mentioned earlier, self-certified, but that does expose us to a little bit of risk down the path. Or the town is at risk for fiscal penalty, legal penalty, developer free-for-all opportunity, and on the extreme, the courts actually have the ability to revoke the town's ability to conduct land use decisions in their entirety. Would any of these things really happen? I don't know. But they are known risks of the town's failure to obtain an approved housing element. So under state law, as part of the housing element process, the town's required to conduct a site inventory of all parcels that are underdeveloped and analyze that development potential for those sites. As we move through the process of developing our housing element and identifying potential solutions, the council asked the staff evaluate the development potential of the Bear Gulch site, Menlo College, and Menlo School at the state's default density of 20 units per acre. Sites included in the housing element that would be zoned at 20 units per acre meet the state's default density for affordability, and the town is not then required to conduct a feasibility analysis. To be clear, the housing element is just a plan, not a mandate that the housing will occur in the areas or at the density planned. With the exception of any town-controlled sites, development remains at the discretion of the landowner. We do, however, have to report on progress each year, and the state will require that the town adjust its policies and programs if the plan is not being achieved. The staff report provides the requested high-level development analysis of each site. It does not address all of the issues that would need to be addressed as part of any full CEQA or development analysis. That deeper analysis would come later as the town moves through any rezoning process. Staff also includes a recommendation for the council if the council chooses to add the site development at 20 units per acre as part of the housing element. In all cases, staff's recommendation is less than what the development potential could be for the entirety of those sites. In addition, this afternoon, the council should affirm the 6 policy bullets within section 3.380 of the housing element, which are elimination of the occupancy limitation on guest houses and pool houses, amending the code to increase the height limit to allow ADUs over garages, and some of that's possibly moot to some degree by recent changes in state law. Amend the code to allow 2 ADUs on a property. Amend the code to allow multiple ADUs to be rented on a property. Amend the fee resolution to eliminate the planning fee for ADUs and adopt a housing impact fee. The housing element tonight is not a discussion of the specific development and implementation details of any of those ordinance or policy changes. Each of those would have to go through a public review process that would begin with the Planning Commission and result in a recommendation for consideration by the council later. The overall objective of the site analysis is to ensure that the housing production projected as part of the cycle, as part of the housing element, meets or exceeds the allocations in all categories. The town is required to specifically identify sites that can produce the 148 new low and very low income units, 56 moderate income housing units, and 144 above moderate units. The income level targets for those units, their affordability is set by state law and ABAG, not the town. The beginning portion of the housing element document includes a narrative that's required by state law to address affirmatively furthering fair housing, or AFFH, requirements. That narrative includes information written by the 21 Elements Group and root policy firms hired collectively via the county to assist jurisdictions in meeting this mandate. Among a host of other analyses, state law requires that the town identify and examine patterns, trends, disparities, and needs both within the town and within the region based on race and other characteristics, to include an assessment of contributing factors, including the local and regional, historical, and current policies and practices of integration, segregation, exclusion, and affluence. However, in reviewing the data and analysis provided, the narrative does not appear to be equally balanced in many areas. Staff and others will work on wordsmithing this document to create a more balanced analysis, as well as updating to the extent possible the census data points to 2021 versus 2019. The 2021 census numbers are far more favorable to the town with respect to our narrative around existing rentals. I don't believe it's productive to wordsmith the document this evening at this meeting, as the data points will have very little impact on the town's selection of planning sites or the policy bullets. We can wordsmith the document offline, and the council can review it again at the January 11th study session. As seen in the table in the staff reports, housing production at the sites exceed the RHNA targets at the moderate and above moderate categories. Most of those targets at the above moderate category will be exceeded as a matter of course and are not as critical as the lower categories, the very low and low. Vacant sites will develop. New home development will likely include an ADU incentivized by the town's square footage exemption. The two areas where development is not a matter of course in the above moderate category is the SB 9 lot splits and the development at 23 Oakwood. Within the staff report, there are 8 identified areas of development. We'll remove one of those, the Bear Gulch, so we're down to 7. I'd suggest that the council move through each of them and then discuss and affirm their inclusion as part of the strategy for submission to the state, then move through the 6 policy bullets to discuss and affirm each of those. Lastly, at the end of the meeting, the council should provide some specific direction on the format of the planned community engagement meetings in January. Brief note on each of the identified sites before turning it back to the council and staff. First, development on the Bay Road item that was included in there is for discussion purposes only, and it's not recommended as included as a development opportunity in the submittal at this time. The overall ADU production number has been maintained at 35 units per year, using average production over the last 4 years inclusive of 2021, plus production of ADU conversions and JADUs. However, HCD may not accept the town's production methodology, and they do have the discretion to lower it. And they've already specifically questioned the income level assumptions, in other words, how it's distributed throughout that table. HCD does not support the town's use of ADUs as a primary means of meeting the very low and the low category requirements because it finds such housing to be exclusionary by nature. If the town continues reliance on the strategy, it is possible that the HCD department will reject the town's submission and require the town to reduce reliance on ADUs and identify some other development opportunities. Third, staff reduced the production estimate for SB 9 lot splits, but HCD may lower this even further. This is not as critical as is it expected that these productions will fall in the above moderate category. Further, to include Menlo College, HCD will require that the development be by right of at least 20 units per acre. The same standard should apply to Menlo School. For Menlo College, I would also encourage some formal correspondence from Menlo College that they are more solidly moving down the path to a housing solution. Lastly, 23 Oakwood is included at the state's default density of 20 units per acre. Density less than that will require a feasibility analysis be conducted, and the state will not accept that density as suitable for affordable housing. Zoning at 20 units per acre is considered to be suitable for affordable housing, although the state requires additional justification on the likelihood of redeveloping non-vacant sites. Staff consultants can address this issue for the parcel. If the site appears likely to redevelop, such as a commitment from the property owner, the town could shift all of the development potential into the very low and the low category and use 23 Oakwood as the town's sole rezone of a single family lot and address any rebuttal comments by the state. However, if that's not the case, the town would need to identify another opportunity to gain 10 affordable units to replace the loss of the Bear Gulch units. Considerations could include higher density at Menlo College, moving it from the 40 units to something higher, Bay Road, El Camino Real, or even the Gilmore House on town property within the park. Our most challenging category to fulfill will be the sites at the very low and the low income housing categories. The element must offer non-exclusionary zoning opportunities. As drafted, opportunities at the college and the school provide affordable housing opportunities to students, faculty, and staff only, and ADUs in 23 Oakwood provide the balance. That concludes my presentation. Again, staff's here to answer any questions or address specific issues, but I'll turn it back over to the council.
Yeah, I have one. This thing that I just heard about self-certifying, is there any credence to that?
There it goes. What the state law says is that if you get a letter from HCD stating that the element doesn't comply with state law, you can take one of two actions, or you can combine them. Change the element to substantially comply with the article, or adopt it without changes. And then you have to have something included in your resolution explaining why the town believes that the draft element substantially complies with state law despite HCD's findings. So it is possible to do that. It's pretty risky, I would say, given the length of the letter that the town received. I think what most communities are doing, communities used to wait until they had a letter from HCD saying their draft was adequate in order to, and then they would adopt their housing element. But because of the January 31st deadline and all the publicity about the builder's remedy, most communities are going ahead, taking the HCD letter, responding as well as they can, and then adopting without having confirmation from HCD that what they adopted conforms. So I believe what most communities are doing is that they're making as many changes as they can, or attempting to respond to, all of HCD's comments as best they can, and then going ahead and adopting. And so we've recommended all along that let me back up just 1 second. The standard for an adequate housing element is one, that the housing element contains everything that the statute requires. And then the second requirement is that you have substantial evidence to support all your conclusions. And so what we suggested is for the first one, and I think Lisa's working on this, is that we've prepared a table that has all the requirements of the statute. And when you whenever the town adopts the element, one of the attachments will be a table showing how the element includes everything that the statute requires. By the way, this table is like 21 pages long, which tells you a little bit about the complexity of housing element law. And then secondly, there'd be a second table that explains how the town is responding to each of HCD's comments. At that point, if the town decides that it disagrees, with HCD's conclusions, you could say that. I think we've all advised the town that we believe that there needs to be some significant multifamily zoning in the town in order to meet the requirements of state law, which does require specifically that there be opportunities for multifamily housing.
But so in effect, though, what the town is doing at the end of January is adopting our housing element and submitting it to the state.
Yes.
That is a form of self-certification.
Or, right, the way we're having you do it is a form of self-certification, saying we're adopting it, we think it conforms, and then, yes.
So what happens after 120 days? We're going to get a rejection.
Well, there's no, they actually only have 60 days to review your adopted housing.
Yeah, but
element.
we have to have a certified housing element or within 120 days, as I understand it. Lots of bad things happen.
If you don't have if HCD doesn't approve your housing element within 120 days after January 31st, so that's about May 1st, I think, or May 31st, sorry. Then you only have a year to adopt the zoning, whatever zoning you have in the housing element. If they do approve your housing element within that 120-day period, you'd have 3 years to adopt the zoning. Does that make sense?
Well, the numbers you just gave me make sense, but adopt what zoning? We don't have a certified element, so
No, we do.
If we serve.
Yeah, whatever. Yeah, I mean, I think what you would do, first of all, let's say you get a letter from HCD saying that they still don't think your housing element complies. I think most cities in response to that have attempted to make additional changes to try to get the housing element approved. But let's say that the housing element wasn't approved after this period. I think the cities have and towns have gone ahead and just adopted whatever zoning they had in their housing element, what they proposed,
And then continued on as if,
and then continue to work with
HCD.
HCD. Because if HCD has not approved the housing element and the zoning is still not done after a year, that's a further argument by which to attack the town.
at what point will we start getting lawsuits from the various EMB groups? And at what point would the builder's exemption kick in?
In terms of the first question, somebody could sue you on February 1st, regardless of whatever you'd done or whatever HCD decided, and say your housing element doesn't
Anybody can sue
conform.
anybody.
Yeah, anybody can sue. In terms of the builder's exemption, or the builder's remedy, as it's now called, that becomes, somebody again could file, oh, I'm sorry.
I'm sorry to interrupt. I don't advise giving legal advice that might
Oh, I'm
put,
sorry. Mona.
so I respectfully request to not provide any kind of response about liability to the town in open session.
The question was, Mona, at what point would we be subject to a builder's remedy? And I think it's a very valid question.
I understand, but I also recommend not providing information that might put the town in a vulnerable position or to advise potential opponents as to how to challenge the town.
We get it. Thank you.
So just to clarify, Barbara, what you said, my understanding is that I hadn't focused on this before, but the plan is that we respond as completely as we're capable, or as we believe we're capable, to the comments that we've received from HCD. And then by January 31st, we certify our housing element. So we do exactly what the public comment was, which is that we certify our housing element as of January 31st, notwithstanding the fact that we may receive additional comments from HCD. And in fact, we may make additional changes. And if HCD independently doesn't certify our housing element or state that it complies with 120 days, then we go forward and rezone as we've proposed to do in the housing element that we have certified. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's a very good summary.
Okay.
He's
That's
attorney.
a good clarification.
He's
Are
an
there other
attorney.
questions from members of the council?
So
Elizabeth?
a question, if we could get Menlo College to to become bigger than what we're putting here and get commitments from them to put in our housing element that would really solve a lot of these issues, I believe, as far as high density, because if you're saying that you feel that they really want us to do some kind of high density in town, well, we'll check off that box. If we can get enough high density and at that location with enough low income units that are carved out. And then also maybe do the same thing with Menlo School. I think that that could solve all of our problems. So how realistic is that? Is that something that we should really pursue and look forward to and put in our housing element? I think the position of filing by January 31st and saying, this is our housing element. We've done the best we can do. This is how we're going to meet the requirements of HCD, including the Menlo College and Menlo School site, I think is a really good one. And I think we would have a very good chance to prove that.
Is there a question?
Yes, how feasible is that?
There was a question.
There was a question, how
Maybe-
feasible is that?
I can start with a comment on your possible question. I think some of the issue with the Menlo College site is that it's considered exclusive. You need to be an employee or faculty or a student there. But Menlo College certainly could rent it to the general public as well. And so if there's a commitment from them to that effect, I think that would go a lot farther. And I don't know if there's anything to add.
Guess my question is, could we get that commitment from them, and how many units would they have to commit to opening it up to the public?
Okay, I'm looking for additional questions from members of the council. I have a question. The sixth policy, so your recommendation on how we proceed through this is we take the properties one by one as they've been listed in the staff report. And we go through those and we make decisions with respect to each one of them. And then we address the 6 bullet point policy items. Where are the 6 bullet point policy items?
They're in section 3.380.
3.3. Oh, they're in attachment 1.
Yes, the housing element itself.
3.380. That's on page 40.
Is it possible to share this stuff on the screen so everybody
I
sees what
think
we're
it's
talking
listed on
about?
page 40. Well, I'm just looking at the index. It says 3.380 is page 40. I don't see that either. Maybe it's not page 40, maybe.
So they're up on the screen there as well. I've just shared my notes.
Okay, but what, I mean,
What page of it is in the pack? That's in the staff.
I'll have to go look.
so
there.
is that the staff report?
Yeah.
No, that's my notes.
That's your notes?
Yeah, I'll pull up the
Okay.
staff report and tell you what page in
But
a second.
are they in attachment 1? Attachment 1 is the response to HCD, right? The current draft.
The current draft, yes. I'll find that for you.
Okay. So any other questions? Any objection to going through them property by property as recommended by staff? Yeah.
I was just going to ask that we share like they're doing on the screen so we can eat all in the whole room can see what we're talking
Well,
about.
it's his notes, so
Yeah.
you don't have those. Oh, they're on the screen. I understand, but it might, if they happen to be in what
It
was sent to us.
begins on page 64 of the housing element,
64.
bottom right-hand corner of the housing element document. On the PDF, it's page 75.
Great.
Mhm.
Okay. Thank you.
Mhm.
Okay, so if there's no objection, from members of the council, we will go through these one at a time, but I'll take public comment first. Jack, would you like to make a public comment? But you need to go up to the speaker, Jack.
Zoning is a city, county responsibility, not the state's. it seems to me that the state is intruding on city and county responsibilities and that we should not let them get away with it. Like,
Rod, grab the microphone.
I actually had two questions of Barbara. Barbara, you're the planner, is that, or the attorney for the plan? Or is it Diana? Okay. She had said that the state requires multifamily housing. Could you please provide for us the actual code section that indicates that? Because I haven't been able to find it. And then the other thing you suggested was the state requires public access to the housing. Could you also provide that so we understand where exactly that comes from and what the letter of the law is?
You want her to answer that now or offline? Okay, it might take her a bit to go through and find it.
There's an attachment to the staff report that indicates the basis for every single one of HCD's comments. In terms of the need for multifamily housing, there are several places in the housing element law where it says that the element needs to account for a variety of different housing choices. It needs to account for multifamily housing, single room occupancy housing, transitional and supportive housing. Just looking for where exactly
This attachment 3 we're talking.
yeah, it's in attachment 3. So it lists every single thing. So there's, let's see. Okay, so one place where it's listed is Government Code Section 65583A5. Number 30.
Paragraph number?
Yeah. Oh, number 18. Okay. So Lisa's looking at number 18 here. That's for the densities. Let's see.
Zoning for lower income households?
Well, first of all, it talks about for the number of units calculated to accommodate the share of the regional housing needs. This is in 65583.2 C3.
Yes.
It has
Yeah,
to,
you're on the right section.
yeah, that's number 18. It has to accommodate at least 20 units an acre. Let's see. I was looking at, it talks about a variety of.
It's also
HCD's comments.
Government Code Section 65583.2 also discusses a specific inventory of housing.
Right. Thank you, Mona. It's also in, I know it's also in 65583.
To the mayor?
Yeah.
It says that a city or county shall do either of the following, and there's an A or a B.
Yeah, if you look at 65583, and I'm sorry, I don't have this. This is like at the start of the housing element content. It says the housing element shall identify adequate sites for housing, including rental housing, factory-built housing, mobile homes and emergency shelters. Then similarly, in 655, as Mona said, in 65583.2.
But I don't
Those
see
are-
where it says it has to be
Those are
density.
excerpts. She's looking at the full.
Oh, got it.
Yeah.
What's that?
I said that what's in the handout are excerpts. But what she's reading from is the actual.
Is
full.
the actual.
And it says that we have to have high density.
Yeah, the 20 units per acre is required for a site to be considered to be adequate for lower income housing. unless you can show that a lower density site is adequate, and I think that would not be possible.
Item 29 very specifically states multifamily.
Okay.
Also.
By the way,
Sorry, the same section that I mentioned, subsection H, identifies the 20 units per acre, low and low income household requirements that are a component of the multifamily.
yeah,
No.
maybe 65583C1, number 29, I think is, you mentioned, is the most specific. Sites shall be identified as needed to affirmatively further fair housing and to facilitate, encourage the development of a variety of types of housing for all income levels, including multifamily rental housing, factory-built housing, mobile homes, housing for agricultural employees, supportive housing, single-room occupancy units, emergency shelters, and transitional housing. So the second part of the question, it was, by the way, I should say I am an attorney and a planner. I should say that in relationship to Lisa's comment about exclusivity, that really has to do with the affirmatively furthering fair housing requirements. So the housing element law was substantially strengthened, between the last cycle and this, to require very detailed analyses of fair housing issues. Particularly, the state was geared at why there is segregation. And I think one of the state's goals is to reduce income segregation as well as, racial and other segregation. So one of the requirements is that the sites that you've identified help to affirmatively further fair housing. And I believe that Lisa was really probably accurately reflecting a concern that if the multifamily housing in the city is only available, or if the low-income housing in the city is only available to faculty, staff, and students, that would seem to be an exclusive group and not to generally encourage people, lower income people to live in the town.
Yeah, so you mentioned, and you just kind of referred to it now with regards to housing on the Menlo College site, and that it wouldn't count because it was not open to the public.
It counts.
Okay, doesn't count as high density. That you kind of implied that, and I just want to go back and say, first off, the people that are living in the dorms, they would be renting an apartment somewhere else, but they're in a dorm. But the dorm doesn't count because of the fact that now they want a separate bathroom and a separate kitchen, despite the fact that everybody who lives in the dorm has a pass to get their meal over at the cafeteria, where they're providing 3 meals a day for everyone who's living on campus. So now they're proposing to build not only rooms, but apartments for people that many of them would be living there year round, because they'd either be taking classes or they're athletes or they're faculty members. And they're living there all the time. And, there are problems with having a situation where you're having people from the public on your property interacting with your students. And so that's a problem for them. And, and I just don't see why that wouldn't count. It should count. And I think that that's probably our best bet for getting something done is to continue to work with the college and meet their needs as they are trying to expand and trying to hire new faculty members who can't afford to live here. And if they came here, they'd be renting a place anyway. And it makes it more palatable for them to have housing as part of their package.
So can I just follow up quickly on that? Just real quickly, because so it should count. It's got to count towards our numbers. So then what we're looking at, I know, but then what we're looking for is the low, very low, someplace else. Won't some of our ADUs do that?
Okay, so the Menlo College site will count as providing housing, right? The unit's going to count. It's going to qualify as low-income housing. It qualifies, and I'd rather use the term multifamily than high density because 20 units an acre is not high density. You need to get into the 80 or 100 units an acre to be
That's
considered
what I'm
high density.
proposing.
So multifamily is the better terminology to use. The concern is though, it doesn't address the entirety of the state law because it's considered exclusive housing. So it will absolutely count. What HCD is going to look for though is another site that's multifamily, that's more inclusive as a rental option. But yes, it will count.
And yes, ADUs will also count if they're rented to low income, and we can prove that and we can report that and all that sort of stuff. But what HCD is going to look at for ADUs is they don't really think of them as Lisa described, as open to the general public. They think it's a little exclusive. So we've got to have a very active, very engaged, very committed ADU rental and reporting program in order to meet that obligation.
As we've discussed with respect to a particularly robust ADU program, one that partners with a low-income housing group that will recommend and qualify potential renters who would qualify as low-income or very low-income renters. Of course, the concern is that that doesn't necessarily mean that the owner of the ADU rents to those people.
Right.
But okay, that in no case has anyone on this council proposed that anyone would be forced to rent an ADU. But we would create a program that could recommend to any residents that are interested, potential renters who properly qualify. And that would be non-exclusionary in terms of the recommendations coming from the nonprofit group. And notwithstanding the fact that the state, this goes to Jack's comment, might claim that that's still exclusionary because the homeowner gets to choose whether they're actually going to rent or not, we can certify that we believe that qualifies. And I think that it's incumbent upon us to ensure or do the best job we can do to ensure that we put in place a very robust and rigorous program that actually is going out to identify and qualify those potential renters.
Right. And that helps us on the back end, but it doesn't help us on the front end. If we're still seeking to get state certification, even though we self-certify, there's still that risk out there of being non-certified or the state rejects it and they lower our ADU number, then they're going to look to us to find another solution.
So let me just follow up on a question that already got asked by the public and that Barbara responded to, but I've been asked by a number of both residents and non-Atherton residents who are interested in what we do here about what I've interpreted from the comments that we've gotten from you and from Lisa that we're required to have multifamily housing. So I think the question is really relevant and I'd like to be able to identify where. I do know the section in 65583.c.2 C3, which and it was referred to in the HCD letter to us, which specifically said that since you're a suburban jurisdiction, you zone for 20 or more units an acre, then they don't need to do the economic analysis in terms of the low versus very low versus moderate income. I totally understand that, but that isn't telling me that we have to have multifamily.
Well-
And my guess is it's in here somewhere. I can't.
Yeah,
find it.
I think, we've recited various code sections, but I do think the most clear, again, is 65583C1. Sites shall be identified as needed, blah, 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 to facilitate and encourage the development of a variety of types of housing for all income levels, including multifamily rental housing. Yeah. Well, as need, this is in the program section of the document. So as needed means, do you need a program because you don't have one, because you don't have this now to identify multifamily rental housing?
And I think
I think
the
for the
modifier of
town,
as needed as well, staff sites shall be identified as needed to affirmatively further fair housing,
yeah,
which is the state requirement.
right.
And that's what the as needed is referring to.
Yeah.
Right.
Okay. So let me just, I know there's a couple more questions. My guess is questions are gonna come up as we go through property by property. I'd like to get in, we're an hour into it. I don't want to keep it all night. And I'd like to start the process of going into the property.
I still would like to ask the city manager a question.
Go ahead.
So your position, George, and what you've communicated to us is that the state will require us, if you build an ADU, to find out who's living there, what their income levels are, and then report that. So, and of course, as you and I have discussed privately, now not privately, many people don't want to do that, and they want to have the right to, keep that private. What are other communities doing other than engaging HIP housing? What are they doing to find out what the income level is of the other people in the, let's say, in Hillsborough or in, San Mateo County? Are they, for ADUs or home sharing, how are they collecting data about people's finances that perhaps they don't want to share?
Through the nonprofit groups, just like we're proposing.
I can also answer that question in terms of a lot of jurisdictions are collecting data from sites such as Craigslist and apartments.com, Zillow, rentals, and so forth, collecting data from those of prices that are on the open market for ADUs to determine what income category they are. The ones that are going to be at probably at no rent, i.e. extremely low income, those are not going to be posted on Craigslist. So the data that we have is really geared towards maybe high, low income, moderate income, and above moderate income. But that's how the data has been collected in certain jurisdictions.
Well, since we have a councilwoman from Redwood City, maybe she could tell us how they do it in Redwood City. I think it's important.
That's a great question, and I'm happy to get back to you on that.
I could also add that another method that some jurisdictions use is sending out a survey to the owners of ADUs. Usually it doesn't ask, it basically usually gives income ranges and says, if you have a studio, is your income range in this area? Is the unit occupied? Is the income range this, or is the income range that? So it doesn't ask exactly how much rent they're getting. It just gives them a range. Or I have one client that tries to collect that information when the permit is pulled for the building for the ADU and asks what their intent is.
And we do that as well.
Yeah.
Okay, this is appropriate for when we get to the ADUs. This isn't, I'm stopping this. We're moving into this property area by property area. George.
No question.
Which is the first property you want to address?
The first on the list, I think Menlo College.
Okay. And this is just a free-for-all discussion.
Yeah, it's in there presently at 20 and 20, 20 in the very low and low and 20 at the moderate. But I know that there have been some other discussion where it could be
Okay,
increased.
so I'll give some comments
Yeah.
on this. I've met twice with Stephen Weiner with some other people. And my purpose in meeting with Stephen was to explore the possibilities of Menlo College providing multifamily housing, as it's been discussed here, and of what quantity of housing he felt that the college would be able to support. And he identified a number of locations. They currently have 20 or 25 housing units that are filled by staff, and they have a great need for additional. He said it was absolutely a slam dunk to fill 20. And he believed that if the renters could be not just faculty and staff, but also students, that they'd be able to fill 60. And he identified 3 different locations on the campus where he thought that they could do that. And I have met with some residents and Stephen, and I know separately a developer has met with Stephen to discuss the possibility of doing something there. And there are all kinds of difficulties around funding. So at the end of the day, identifying what can be done, I think, is our charge, because we need to zone that property for what we think is reasonable. I know what is in the staff report is contemplated, I think it's 40 units. Stephen clearly said that they could support, he believed, 60 units if it included students. I don't see any reason, it's not up. I mean, I would personally support having students, faculty, and staff. We don't have to discriminate. He can choose. It's his property. I would recommend that we zone that. This is the O'Brien parking lot at the corner of Alejandra and El Camino. I personally would support seeing up to a 4-story building there, as long as it's facing El Camino. It's immediately across El Camino from the Park Forest apartment complex, which is a 4-story apartment complex. So it's very appropriate for that area. And I would propose that we zone that for, I think it's a 1-acre parcel that he's looking at for 60 units. And of course, if they decide to build less, they can build less.
So
One just comment is the town doesn't actually have the right to confine who can live there. That's,
Yeah, I'm
yeah.
just giving that comment.
Yeah,
because
yeah, I'm just saying,
it
so,
isn't,
so even if they wanted
it
to,
isn't totally inclusive. I mean, it's not the general public. His intent would be to limit it
Right.
to,
and
those at the
that's fair, but
college.
I'm just saying if for some reason they didn't have enough, students, whatever.
they could rent it
They
to the
could rent it
public.
to whoever they want.
That's their
Yeah,
decision.
yeah.
And we're not going to get in the way of that. Okay, Bill,
So
and then Elizabeth.
I also have met with Stephen and others, along with Rick. There was a number of residents that proposed and have been talking to him for a while about development. And for the most part, we listened to what Stephen had to say. And I agree with Rick that going to 60 is a feasible number. He has some growth plans for the college, and I think that would be worthwhile. If in fact he couldn't possibly meet that, his neighbor right next door, Menlo School, is also looking for housing for some of their professors. And so that could be his choice as to whether or not he wants to go do that. But, he believes 60 is a good number, provided, he's not sure what his enrollment's going to be. And in fact, as other private schools have been hit with the COVID over the past years, and the students go home and get refunds, you know, there is some concern on the cost and being able to pay for it, but he also is looking for funding, and I know there's a citizen group here that is working with him on that. So thank you. I wanted to disclose my conversation with him.
Elizabeth.
So I've also spoken with President Weiner on numerous occasions, just one-on-one, not with anyone else. So full disclosure there. And in my discussions with him, he feels really positive about the opportunity to have a multi-story apartment, multifamily, high density unit built on that corner. I live just down the street on the corner of Emily and Alejandra. So I'm not opposed to it being in my backyard, quote unquote. And I do believe it's a 1.5 acre site, maybe even 1.6 actually. And I think that it could be done very, very tastefully with a lot of its own kind of interior amenities and outside spaces so that it's just not a 4-story concrete block, you know, ugly building. I think that the development could be really, really strong. And the numbers that I think that we could push that 60 number to maybe even 80 or something like that as a proposed, I mean, to allow that much. It's not saying that we're mandating or requiring them to build that many, but it could be zoned to be that big in that size of a lot there.
Can I ask a question? I guess I'm the only one who's not talking to Steve. But my question to clarify from you guys, when you're saying, you're talking about 60 units, are you still assuming that we're zoning it at the numbers that are in the proposal here? And you're just saying we should assume, or are you actually saying we're gonna have 60 units per acre?
I
So
would zone
60
it at
per
60
acre.
acre, 60 an acre.
Zone it for 60 per acre.
Go ahead.
We've estimated the entire property to be 1.7 acres. That would be in question. I mean, there's going to be the setbacks, right? So he may not build in the entire area, but that area, so we had estimated 1.7 acres.
But you wouldn't necessarily need to zone it at 60 units per acre. You could zone it at something around 40 units per acre
30,
and
my math says about 35 units to the acre.
about 35 to the acre to get to your 60 units.
Let me just ask the question. If there's a 1.7 acre site and you zone it for 40 an acre and they only build on 1 acre of the 1.7, can they put 60 units on that?
Hmm?
So that's denser than 40 an acre.
Cluster the development and have more of the space.
Well,
And this would be by right,
let's do
correct?
40 an acre, then I'm fine with that.
And by right.
It's by right.
So that, this is all with this direction, but it's also with the caveat that we need something from Menlo College that says we're interested in doing this. We're committed to moving forward.
Well, I've specifically talked to him about that.
Yeah.
I showed him the letter that he had previously sent to us, and he said that if they had initial funding, that he could rewrite the letter and he would consider a change the letter. So I offered to give him a recommended change, but I think that he first wants to at least have a site plan that somebody has financed, and so that he's got to have more confidence that funding is coming along. And I understand the next step is for the developer to meet with him and for them to talk about it. So I think that targeting mid-January to get that revised letter is doable.
So-
It's not guaranteed,
Right.
but it's doable. And I think that that's our target from our zoning perspective, which is what I think is on our plate right now. We could zone this for 40 an acre, but there's more than just the one site that, I mean, they're not going to build multiple buildings, but they might choose to do it in a different site.
Right. So for the general plan purposes, we're including 60 units, 30 at the very low and low, maybe 30 at the moderate. And then that makes up for the loss of the 10 units from Bear Gulch that we're not going to be considering.
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly. And my question is, do we need to zone for the parking lot at the front of the administration building, which you access off El Camino? That is another site he said was a possibility. Do we need to do something different for that?
We can also include that site at 20 units an acre, but not assume we're going to see the development in this cycle. So it wouldn't go in the table, but we would identify it.
Okay. And the third site was where their World War II barracks are. That are currently housing units. There are 4 housing units that they might combine that location with the O'Brien parking lot. It's immediately adjacent to the O'Brien parking lot.
But if he articulates those additional sites within his letter, that would be helpful to staff to be able to.
Yeah, I think that he wouldn't have a problem with that.
Yeah, I'd like to clearly note it on a site plan. So that'd be helpful.
Okay, the next one is Menlo
So is that all
School.
we need to do here? We don't need to vote on something.
No, I have consensus direction.
Okay. Go ahead.
Next one is Menlo School. Menlo School is proposed in the housing element at, I believe it's 10 and 10. And originally it was in the housing element at just 10 units. We adjusted it this time around to 10 and 10 based on their prediction that they would have a need of 20. So we're just looking for concurrence from the council that that's appropriate.
I think it's perfectly appropriate. Do we need to zone? We need to do some zoning by right for them
For
also.
Menlo School, it would be by right as well, yes.
And is that at 40 an acre or 20 an acre? What do?
This is 20 an acre, I
That
believe.
20 an acre, correct?
Okay.
There was comments in the staff report about where that would be located. Did you want us to opine on those?
Yeah, the thought would be at essentially the school entrance at Valparaiso where there's parking now, because that's really the only vacant space on that.
Yeah, there's yeah, I know where it is. Yeah, well, there was substantial comment from the people in Victoria Manor with regards to multi-story and overlook and things like that. So I would only support something that's well set back and possibly just on the southwest side as opposed to the east side. Yeah.
So that's site number 1. I
There's
think.
2 sites identified and you're referring to, correct, the one site. The suggestion was that we retain the 75-foot setbacks when you're adjacent to a single family zone, but that you reduce the setback along Valparaiso to provide adequate space for the building.
What's the height limitation?
The suggestion is to increase it to 4 stories or 48 feet.
Well, if it's going
It's
to be,
immediately across the street from a 6 or 8 story apartment building. The high rise at the corner of Valparaiso and University.
but depending on the height, then the setback from the side needs to potentially be looked at, okay? That's, well, we have to see a plan, but, you know,
The development standards would come later, but we take the council's point on that.
Okay.
okay.
Okay, so now we've approved multifamily on 2 sites. Let's move on to private property.
Before we go, I can ask one question. Is there a reason why we wouldn't give both schools the same kind of allotment?
And also the proximity to single family houses. is a big deal.
Proximity, single family, but the Valparaiso is not, though. I thought we just said that.
It is across the street from Menlo Park, Valparaiso.
Just one thing, somebody
yeah.
used the term guiding principle.
Stevens.
We fumbled around when we started with this, trying to find guiding
Yes, that's what
principles.
thank you. That's where I was trying to go with that.
But after spending way too many hours bringing my hands over this thing, I think the overriding guiding principle is that we don't want to do we want to make every conceivable effort to not do something that deteriorates anyone's value in their property. And some of these projects we've looked at wouldn't, like 170 Atherton Avenue. It would have selling $5 million townhomes in there is not going to reduce anybody's property value. But putting a 4-story building up that's looking down into somebody's backyard is going to do it. So that, to me, that's the guiding principle, number one. There's probably some others we should have, but is that it doesn't affect people's property values.
Okay, the first one on private property is 23 Oakwood. This is the one where there is a property owner interest, and the staff recommendation is you consider zoning that at 20 units per acre by right. That would produce the 26 units at likely the above moderate, and then through the inclusionary ordinance density bonus, 6 units at the very low and low. Is that correct, Lisa?
That's correct.
The
Potential.
inclusionary ordinance would apply to this on private property. Would it apply to what we've already approved in the 2 school sites?
An inclusionary ordinance would apply to all properties, yes.
And there's a state law around that as well, right?
There's state law that it applies.
Density bonus.
Pardon?
There's a state law around density bonus requirements too, right?
I'm sorry, I didn't.
Is there a state law that requires that the density bonus provisions apply to affordable housing at 20 units per acre?
The density bonus applies to any project of 5 units or more that has actually as little as 5% affordable housing.
There you go. So yes.
It has nothing to do with.
But if it's
with-
if somebody chooses to build 100% market rate development and the town does not have an inclusionary ordinance, then there's no affordability
Right,
requirements.
right.
Gotcha. Okay.
Yeah.
So are we assuming we've approved an inclusionary ordinance?
That's part of the
It's one of
recommendations.
the programs
with respect
suggested in
to
the housing
Menlo
element.
School and Menlo
Yes.
College properties. Okay.
Yeah.
Bill, and we're on 23 Oakwood.
Yeah, I know. On 23 Oakwood. Obviously, as everybody knows, we've discussed this thing several times, and we've gotten a substantial amount of input, as well as input from the homeowner that wants to develop, who I have spoken to. Dave called me a couple of weeks ago and wanted to know what's going on. And so I told him the schedule of these meetings, and that was it. Previous to that, there's been some discussion by several homeowners that 20 per acre was too dense. And elsewhere in the community, we were targeting 10 acres, 10 per acre. And the indication from that was that that would be more palatable, provided that, it was built to look like Atherton housing and things like that. And so I have a little bit of a hard time, going up to the numbers that are in the staff report. I'd prefer to go with 10. At a previous council meeting, Mr. Arata had indicated, 10 could work. I don't see a need to put undue, we just talked about, we're going to have a little ordinance to say that we're not going to try and decrease anybody's property values. And I think, reducing it would be, 10 was what I think we had heard from a number of residents, not all, but a number of them. And I think that might be more appropriate. Then that's how I feel. And there could be a density bonus on top of that, but that's it. That's my 2 cents.
I had a comment before you go forward. So I forgot to mention on the 23 Oakwood one, this one does provide the 6 additional units are within that very low income category. So if you don't do it at 20 units per acre and there's no affordability units associated with it, most of those units are probably going to be at the above market or market rate. And that doesn't do the town much good. We've already got a number of units at that level. So then the question becomes, why do it at all?
Can I ask?
But they're going to be above. They're going to be above moderate income anyway.
But if it does develop to its fullest capacity and there is a density bonus required. then it's affordable.
If he does the density bonus.
My understanding from reading the HCD letter was that they specifically said that if you zone it in Atherton for 20 or more an acre, they don't do an economic analysis. They assume a certain number of them are low and very low income.
It'll help us get the plan approved, but it's not going to be what's built. So it's going to come home to roost at some point.
But and I have a question, which is, if we don't approve, and I understand HCD's position, and it's clearly stated in their letter. But if we don't approve the 20 an acre, we're not waiting for HCD to certify us anyway. We're going to certify our own plan. So we could certify based on our analysis, whatever we conclude to be
That would
correct.
be- I don't think that would work. I would think that you really, in order to really pass muster in terms of self-certifying, you really have to follow the letter of the law, and specifically, if you don't have 20 units to the acre, you cannot count them potentially as lower income. And that is the issue facing, I think, the town, is really finding enough sites to accommodate those lower income units.
So that's.
Diana.
I wanted to ask where we are in the numbers here, because in this meeting, we bumped up the college numbers. We lost the Bear Gulch. Are we at the point where we could eliminate the overlays on private property? How short are we where are we now in the numbers? Help me with the math.
At static, all we did was trade out the 10 at Bear Gulch for 10 more at
Just
Menlo
equaled
College.
it out?
Yeah.
So we still need to. Is the Gilmore House on this list?
The Gilmore House is not, but we're on 23 Oakwood at
But
present.
it is on that list.
It's not on. the
Oh,
list.
it's not on the list, so it won't be, okay.
Okay, so we're on 32 Oakwood. 23 Oakwood, Elizabeth?
Staff has is 32, and what I heard Vice Mayor say, and I think his argument is very compelling, that if we reduce it from the 20 per acre and do the 10 per acre, that it would be more palatable to the neighborhood, and it could be a more attractive development. And it also, it seems like the developer would, is it amenable to that? That'd be 16.
And you'll lose any affordable units because it's not at 20 units to the acre.
Yeah, we're looking for the low income ones right now.
So my understanding, and I also thought that Bill's comments were cogent, but and I could painfully support 10 an acre on this property. We've had this discussion many times, going back in great detail to our discussions last May. And if we go with 10 an acre, we lose the lower income assurance, which raises the question that was raised, which I think is appropriate, that if we do that, then why are we doing it at all? And I would take the position that we shouldn't do it at all.
Where are you going to get the low income? Are we going to
Well,
get to that here?
I think.
We don't know yet. But I
don't-
guess
we're gonna-
I'm gonna,
we're gonna
I just,
either,
can I just challenge you just real quickly about what you just said? So would Arata build 32 and use the, 20 of the density bonus? Well, we wouldn't have to show that, but he would not rent loan very low, a portion.
So if the town zoned it at 20 units per acre, we get to count that as affordable for the purposes of our housing element. If it never actually comes to fruition and the town meets that obligation because errata develops 10 units and that's all he does, okay, but we still have to comply every year with our annual reporting. And if we're meeting that obligation through some other mechanism like an ADU or some other process, we're fine. But it doesn't, but we still lose that 6 units that we're counting on as part of our plan development.
Yeah, if the development would come in at either a lower density or with fewer affordable units than you showed, then the town would need to show that it still has enough sites, still has enough units designated in the housing element to meet what's remaining of its regional housing need.
And that could be through,
And if not, then you have to find another site to upzone in 180 days.
right.
And that would be something that would have to be done at that point, once you know that he's not going to build the low-income housing. So maybe that's 2 or
Yes.
3 or 4 years away.
Yes, you would have to make that decision when you approve the project.
When we approve the project that he is, or his
Right.
developer has submitted
Right,
through the department.
Right.
Yeah.
okay.
Okay.
And that could be met through some subsequent development at Menlo College at a different site that they've identified or whatever else.
All hypotheticals.
Correct.
City manager, just-
That is correct.
Hypotheticals are nice to look into the future, but
Well, what I've heard is everybody's agrees with Bill that 20 per acre is not reasonable. So the question is, we're going to lose 6 very low and low. Do we zone for multifamily at all?
If we get, one of the questions I was trying to ask, I know we're not on it yet, but there are two properties that are not listed on here that are not public, which are the Gilroy House and the Courtyard. How many would though, if we were to put those on, how many would that do? Because that would allow us to make a decision not to do any zoning on private residences. But could we cover our number with those 2 properties?
The Gilmore House property encompasses probably about 0.9 or so acres, unless you evened it out, so you could probably get an acre out of that corner. And then it's developable like you would any 1 acre parcel. You could carve it out of the park and, you'd have to deal with the legal restrictions on the park property for that. The Courtyard over here, and looking at that further, there is a large SFPUC water line that runs through there with a significantly even larger easement that would prevent the town from really building on top of that. So you'd be kind of restricted in the Courtyard, so it wouldn't work all that well there. But the Gilmore House is a possibility.
How many at the Gilmore House? Could that solve our low income so that we can make a policy decision to not go over on public property,
Yes.
private property, I mean?
In short,
It
yes.
would, it could.
Yeah.
Well, the other question would be the 10 and 10 at Menlo School. There were 2 parcels that were talked about. Are we locked in at 10 and 10? Why wouldn't that be 16 and 16 or?
Well, that we're still stuck with the multifamily rental housing component of the affordable fair housing stuff, that where the colleges and the school are not open to the public. So that's what we're trying to solve here. And that's what 23 Oakwood would have solved as part of that list.
yeah, so
And Gilmore House would solve that too.
If Gilmore House was a senior citizen center,
Yeah.
or would that be considered exclusionary, or was that still public access?
I don't think you can't in the housing element restrict it to seniors only.
Okay.
Yeah.
So-
But you could in the future develop it as senior rental housing, but we wouldn't specify that
Right.
strictly. It's the town property, so the town would choose to work with a nonprofit and develop it
Right.
as it wishes. But it would need to be apartments and not like a care facility, so individual, kitchen units.
So if I remember from Mr. Ratta's presentation to us quite a while ago, when he brought his plans, he talked about his plan was to sell or rent those to teachers that were just moving to the area, starting their career, or possibly police from the surrounding area, et cetera. And those would fall in perhaps not in the very low category for sure, but perhaps in the low category, and many of them would be, some of them would be in the moderate category. So here in the chart, we've lumped the very low and the low, but we must meet each independently. And so I still think the errata property at 10 is a viable way of meeting some of those numbers. I understand what you're saying, city managers, that, well, we still got to find not 6, but maybe 2. And I think that the ADUs, we could bump the ADUs up. Or the Menlo College or the Menlo School.
Well, it looks like there's 3 possibilities here. One is that we go with the staff recommendation, which is to zone it for 20 an acre, notwithstanding what might ultimately be built. 2 would be to zone it for 10 an acre, assuming that we're not going to have anything in the very low and low category, or, I mean, maybe you make some change and can figure out some way to get somebody in very low, but it definitely changes the number, or to do nothing on 23 Oakwood. And you probably want direction.
Yes, sir.
We don't need a formal vote.
No, I just need consensus direction.
I'd like to make a comment. If we could add the Gilroy House to the discussion, and that would solve our
We're going to
problem.
have the Gilroy House in this discussion. We just haven't gotten there yet.
I thought George said it wasn't on the list.
It's not on the list, but the council needs to look at alternatives, and that's an
Okay.
alternative.
So if we're sure we're going to look at alternatives, and then doing nothing sounds a lot better than we're doing nothing. Well, we have to get to these numbers, so,
Yeah, I'd vote to do nothing.
okay. I would if we were looking at the Gilroy House.
Well, we're going to look at the Gilroy House. It's an option.
Can we put it aside for a second and the discussion about the Gilmore House?
Yes. Yes. Okay. Okay, that's a fair request. Let's move on. The next item is Bay Road.
So Bay Road is on this list for discussion only purposes. The council doesn't actually have to discuss it this evening. If you want to move on to another one, it was there to discuss the overlays that the council had discussed before. What that opportunity was, it's an alternative site such as the Gilmore House or others. And there's also the brownstone concept that was floated by a resident to several members of the council and shared as well for the council's conversation. But it's not included in the table.
I think to do anything with the 5 Bay Road properties at this point is a stretch that does not seem that it would move the needle very far, and kind of, it just doesn't seem to me appropriate to discuss.
I agree. As an afterthought, I mean, I think what the council, it will be without me, but what the council is going to need to do is, if they're going to do any multifamily on private property, we're going to have to do some intensive study. And actually, personally, I would encourage them to start doing that sooner rather than later. But I think there are properties, for example, across from the park and places along the El Camino, that are much more appropriate for picking out of a hat to put multifamily on.
Other comments? I mean, we haven't ever formally discussed this brownstone concept, which came up and George circulated in a Friday email. This is like everything else that deals with multifamily in Atherton is a radical idea for our town. And for those that aren't familiar with what's being discussed, there was a proposal that a resident came up with to zone for residents selling the front 100 feet, front being the portion of their property that is next to the road, selling the front to rezone certain properties to enable a resident to sell that front 100 feet, and for no doubt a developer that would buy it to build 4 or 5 townhouses. These would be, I think it was 3-story high buildings that are not exactly on the street, but I think it's like an 8-foot or 10-foot setback from the street. And that they would be essentially 3,000 square foot units and then a private family home could be built in the remaining portion of that property, which would be zoned essentially R1B, which is 1/3 to 1/2 of an acre that would remain depending on how large that property was at the beginning. And one of the locations that the resident recommended to look at was Watkins Road. And the reason that the resident recommended that is because Watkins, approximately half of Watkins is immediately across the street. The property is immediately across the street from the park. And if you ended up building what would essentially look like brownstones along Watkins across from the park, it would be very attractive to a developer who might want to develop that property. That hasn't been supported. I'm just sharing with you, this was a recommendation from a resident. What was discussed that I talked to, and Bob and I talked to George about, was whether that would be something to look at for Bay Road, because Bay Road is right across the street, and there really aren't apartment buildings across the street, but it's smaller properties in Menlo Park. And I think we concluded that, it's kind of something, if we had to, we could talk about at some point, but not recommend moving forward on at this point. Just for full disclosure, that's the conversation that's occurred.
Yeah, and of course, he didn't recommend it for his property. But like everyone else in town has recommended it for anywhere but near me, which is
That's
what the
truth.
common comment from everyone when they hear what we are even talking about.
Actually, his first recommendation was Glenwood, Bill. And
I know that.
And I'm not kidding. That wasn't a joke.
Okay, well, we're about halfway through, so we could take public comment. I think it's appropriate. You said there's a public comment online? Okay. I can't see the online, so you go ahead and manage it.
Go ahead, David.
Yeah, all right. I tuned in late, but I heard you're gonna forget about 23 Oakwood.
No, we've delayed 23 Oakwood. We'll come back to it.
Oh, are you? Okay, well then I'll get off and listen some more. Thank you.
No problem. And was there another comment online?
Yes, we have Diane Howard.
Okay.
Thank you for the opportunity to speak. My name's Diane Howard. I'm with the Redwood City Council, and I want to thank you for having this very thoughtful and thorough discussion and for working towards the direction of an approved housing element. A speaker earlier mentioned that Redwood City has tools that we do not in Atherton, and I wanted to say, yes, we do have resources. In the past, we had approved housing elements which qualified us for community block grant funds and home funds. But more importantly, the partnerships we've developed with our nonprofits have truly enabled us to do below market rate housing in Redwood City. And most importantly is the citizen outreach that we have done to ensure that when we place a housing, potential housing in a neighborhood, let's talk with the neighbors, let's get their input. Let's see if it's something that blends in well with the neighborhood and doesn't cause an unintended disruption, such as gridlock and parking and traffic problems. I went to one of your planning commission meetings a while back where a commissioner stated this person's desire to push this density to the periphery of Atherton to preserve his neighborhoods. And I have to say that was considered, in my opinion, a little insensitive to say, considering your neighbors surrounding you. But I was encouraged to hear the thoughtful conversation of your council this evening. I believe that you're moving in the right direction by asking very good questions. Do you need to use this particular property to answer the problem? You seem to be looking at other ways to do it. We've put our affordable housing throughout Redwood City. We've increased our ADUs tremendously just by making it easier to get them. And I just wanted to let you know that if there's anything we can do to introduce you to nonprofits who would love to work with you, or anything we can do to make it something where you can be successful with your housing elements, we're happy to help. I just think 23 Oakwood should be given a great deal of consideration and listen to the neighborhood. Is this something that really would work, and at what expense to the neighborhood? So thank you for your time. I appreciate it.
Okay, thank you, Diane. And is there any other public comment in this room? Yes.
So I've probably spoken too much already today, but I have another thought. And it relates to the issue of high density housing and low income housing. And again, I don't believe in planning in an ad hoc manner, and I discourage us from doing that, and I continue to discourage us from doing that. But I do want to ask the question, if we were to develop a new zoning element that provided for high density housing, could we restrict that to low income only? And would that satisfy our housing element at some point?
Sure. I would
If
know the
you,
answer.
if you did the zoning and restricted the site to low-income housing only, you would need to show that this town had available adequate resources to make the development feasible. And, you know, as you've indicated, for instance, county has a bond issue, right, with substantial funds available. So if you could make, you know, if you could show that it was feasible, you could do that, but without having adequate financial capability to show that you know, you could make 100% affordable housing feasible. Whatever inclusionary requirement you impose, which is typically around 15 to 20%, needs to allow a private development to be feasible.
Okay.
And I guess my thinking is that if you're going to make a dramatic change from how we've run things in the town of Atherton, you need a dramatic benefit. And if we're not getting a dramatic benefit from being able to provide low income housing, what are we doing? So, thank you.
Okay. Jeff, did you have a comment?
I think that it would be great if George could update this chart in the staff report to break out the very low and a low, because there's 4 categories, not 3. And so it would be great if we could look at the totals and the requirements for each income category. There's nothing set in stone about how you allocate the ADU numbers, and we could allocate more towards the 2 or lower income areas to help get that number. And I think it would be helpful if Lisa could help educate the council as well as residents about the subsidies that are required for low income housing. And the only way we're going to meet this is with the ADU strategy, because people already own the land. I've talked to a couple developers and you hear different numbers, but you know, one told me $500,000 per unit. I heard today from another developer, $900,000 per unit. So if you take 100 units times 500,000, that's $50 million. For 900,000, that's $90 million. I don't know where this money is going to come from. So we should have an economic study so people would really understand what's going on. And we're going to have to solve this with the ADUs, Because that's the only way we're gonna hit the income numbers. Because it just, the subsidy money isn't there. There's no state money, there's no county money, there's no city money. Where else is it gonna come from? Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, from the standpoint of sites, the state combines very low and low income units into one category. So there's, from a site standpoint, there's only 3 categories. I would
Wait,
agree with
sorry,
what
could you
the,
just-
in the chart. Yeah, go on.
Jeff, in the chart, there really are only 3 categories. And so George's chart is correct. It lumps the very low and low into one category, right? And then the moderate and then the above moderate. So that's just how the state lumps it together. Okay.
And in terms of the numbers in the chart, right now, we've agreed to Menlo College, which takes up 10, which had previously been identified as Bear Gulch, and we agreed to 10 in Menlo School. We put the 6, I'm talking about the low category, we put the 6 for Oakwood on hold, and we haven't yet talked about the ADU. So right now, there's a question of 6 and 102 that were allocated for ADUs, but we haven't talked about that yet. But you need to come up to the mic. I know, but no, but there's people online that can't hear unless you're at the mic.
Talking about 6, but 94 is very low. Is that correct? And is that
Yes.
stated that way? Yes.
That's correct. That is the allocation given to the town that it has to accommodate 94 housing units for very low income.
That's a harder number to get to. Okay, just wanted to clarify that.
Well, and yeah, on page 8 of 9, it's combined very low and low, which is a total of 148.
Go to page 8 of 9 of your staff report and look at that chart. And the addition at the total and then the RENA number.
Okay, so let's move on. We've discussed Bay Road. I think we've decided not to do anything on that. But ADUs is the next item on the list.
Overall ADU production was maintained at 35 units per year, using the average production over the last 4 years, inclusive of 2022 numbers that aren't yet complete yet. HCD uses 4 years ending in 2021 for their average. So our argument back to HCD as part of our submission is that we want to use 2022. We're trending up. Those numbers are trending up. We can provide evidence for that because we've got 21, 22, 23 or so housing units per year, and almost every single one of those are also building an ADU with their new home. And in addition to that, we've got another 4 or so ADU conversions and JADUs that are being constructed. And then in addition to that, we've just completed an online survey where we have about 184 to 190 or so respondents that say they are interested in building an ADU over the next 8-year cycle. So with all of that evidence, we believe we can support the number of 35 per year, at least in an argument to HCD. But at the end of the day, HCD does have the discretion when they review the housing element to say, we don't agree with that. And we're only going to give you credit for some number less than that. And then they also don't believe that they're all going to be in the very low category. They could shift the categories for each of those units. And they could also argue, we're not going to allow you to use ADUs as your primary compliance measure for the very low and the low income categories. So with that, it's open to council.
Can you address how you came to the numbers that are in the low, moderate, and above moderate? Because they're not a round percentage. They're like
Right.
36.44 something percent for the very low.
Right.
This was part of a study conducted on behalf of ABAG, the Bay Area regional housing agency that looked at trends throughout the Bay Area of ADUs, and the recommendation for most jurisdictions was to use a distribution of 30% at very low, 30% at low, 30% at mod, and 10% at above mod. The state said that looks good, but refused to actually bless it. But there are a number of jurisdictions that are using that right now in their housing element. And actually in the distribution in the chart above there that you see with very low and low combined, it's actually a very low conservative number. It's only 30% in total rather than the 60% that other jurisdictions are looking at. So I think the question will be whether or not HCD will ask for documentation to prove it, that the 102 units are very low or low. And as we mentioned before, that could be done through either a survey or looking at Craigslist ads, et cetera.
So my question would be, that makes lots of sense. And I think that we had used those numbers, the ABAG numbers previously, and they had quite strong comments about that. And we've changed that from 30, whatever it was, 2020 to what is now
36 for both.
yeah, 36 for both. But if we chose 40% for both, we'd not have to worry about Oakwood.
You're just going to have to justify it. And that's, I think, going to be the biggest lift, whether that number is 102 or some other number for low and very low, you're going to have to find a way to justify it.
Yep. Which I assume that our intent, and correct me if I'm wrong, but our intent is to use what we've contemplated to be a backup survey. We've done an initial survey to see if residents are interested in building ADUs or converting guest houses or pool houses into ADUs. And in response to that, we got about, 375 responses and about 187 saying they were interested in either building or converting, which is no doubt more than will actually do it. But based on that, we're getting information as well as the detailed building information about what ADUs or guest houses or pool houses are out there. And our intent is to go out with a second survey to that subset of people that are interested in building, and the building department has determined have such a structure in their property. And we will find out from them how many, at least those that respond, how many rent, and we'll quantify how many rent at low, very low, whatever categories. And I agree with what Diana said earlier, which is what's on Zillow isn't representative of what's happening with the ADUs. And to the extent we can get real information, which we've talked about doing, and I'm sure we will do, we'll use that, right, to determine that mix. But for this purpose right now, we could choose to use a 40% category, which would still be conservative relative to the 60% that ABAG had used. And so it's just a number adjustment, essentially. Bill.
George, when do we have to do the first reporting on progress? And what is the situation if we don't meet that? The numbers.
The state reporting is due April 1st of each year.
Okay, starting next year, right?
And one of the programs that is included, has been added, is an ADU monitoring program, which they specifically requested that the town look at its numbers every 2 years to see if they conform with what is projected and either adjust them upward or downward, depending upon what the actual production or permitting. It's actually based on permitting. And then if it falls well below what the projection is, then at that point, every 2 years, the town would have to come up with another replacement for that, those ADUs that were, if they were adjusted down, or it could potentially bump them up depending upon actual production.
So since we can't force people to build, I think we have to, as we're looking at this, we need to also consider, where somebody is ready to build, and that's where the 23 Oakwood came in at a reduced number. They were ready to build, or they were ready to move forward, and the college is ready to go if they can come up with the money. I don't know about the school and some of these other locations, but our ADU survey should ask over time when they're planning on doing that, because if we're relying on just ADUs, then they can't all be built in year 8 when the people who committed to build it maybe have sold and moved on.
Can I ask a question about the public access question as it applies to ADUs? If I have, and this is super naive, but if I have an ADU, I build an ADU and I rent it to my father for $10, he's considered low income, he's retired. Would that count, or does it have to be actually on the public market through one of the things you were talking about, like Craigslist, to be considered public access? How do they actually look at that degree or not?
If you did a study and you found that the unit was rented at $10 a month or for free or whatever, that would count as a unit where the rent or whatever was very low income or even extremely low income. So you could count that as a very low income unit. I believe that HCD's concern with, the heavy reliance on ADUs, though, is that typically because these are single family homes and someone's living on, or single family properties, and somebody's living on your property, that the units are not always, or maybe not even often, rented to the general public. And I think that's the concern. And that's what the mayor talked about, having a different program, and the city manager. But I think that's the primary concern about that. I would suspect that 21 Elements did a survey some years ago, I think, for the last housing element cycle, and found that something like a third of the units were at extremely low income rents, probably meaning that they were rented to relatives, friends, maybe household help, maybe, so, but HCD's concern is that, that's all people that somebody knows.
Yeah, and I think that the vast majority of the ADUs that are rented in Atherton are rented to family, household help, and people that are students or school staff that the people know. Their kids go to school, they meet a teacher, the teacher needs housing, they have housing, the teacher moves in, maybe stays there for several years. But I think most of the ADUs are rented that way. I think we need a robust program both to enhance those. We're not doing away with those. People can rent to whoever they choose, but to show that we in fact are working with a nonprofit agency that are qualifying people and providing those to residents that they can then choose to rent from, and some will, and that will go into our records. I think there's several issues on the ADUs that we should discuss here. One, which we've kind of focused on, are the numbers. And given that ABAG did 30%, 30%, 20%, 20%, I would propose here that we do 20%, 20%, 20%, 40%, which
that would
leads
result
us
in 10.
more toward the above moderate. And in the staff report, it includes 40% for the above moderate. But if we adjusted the very low and low to 2020, that would change the number from 102 to 112. And it would change the moderate, if it was 20, it would be half of 112, whatever that is, 56, I think. So that would, in fact, on this paper, solve our numbers problem, and will help us when we come back to 23 Oakwood. But I think that's a reason. I still think that's conservative, given that ABAG did 30-30 and we'd be doing 20-20. It's responsive to HCD's comment. I do think we're going to have to support that with evidence that we get from the survey that we intend to do to the homeowners or those that wish to build, but I think that's appropriate.
I just want, I agree with you on that very heartily. And I think that would fly. I also believe that it's certainly valid and should be acknowledged by HCD if the ADU is being rented to a school teacher that works at Sacred Heart that maybe is a friend or knows the family, just because you have a knowledge of who you are renting to and your housekeeper, that should not be disregarded at all. I mean, I think that these are low-income people that need housing, and if you're providing them, they should be counted, and we should aggressively go out and try to identify them and make sure that they are counted. So, thank you.
How do they assess public accessibility? How is that
They're
assessed?
saying if you rent it, if you advertise it on Craigslist or something. Go ahead, Bob.
112, and then what does that do to the other columns?
56 and then the.
Moderate those to 56 and above average, above moderate stays.
All right, that's fine. That's direction.
Yeah.
And then
Sorry.
maybe while we're here, we could talk about those other policy items.
Sure, they're all related to ADUs. So those were again on page 64 of the staff of the packet, housing element item. 64.
The sixth item, both page 64 of the pack.
So the first one on that list is well, some of them are easier than others. Expanding community outreach, that's a given. Developing assistance programs, that's also a given. Amending the zoning code to eliminate the occupancy limitation on accessory units such as guest houses and pool houses. Currently, guest houses and pool houses, because they don't qualify as ADUs, don't qualify as technically habitable long-term spaces. So you're only allowed to rent or to use those for 30 days or less.
Yeah.
That's our current code.
Yeah.
We discussed it.
Yeah.
No,
Yeah.
we just.
Yeah.
Amended
Well,
it.
people are doing it already and they're there more than 30 days, so I don't see a risk to approving it.
It's a building code issue, I believe. But now we're not talking about ADUs. We're talking about guest houses and pool houses that don't qualify as ADUs. So they don't qualify as long-term habitable spaces. So we'd have to investigate whether that's feasible, how the building code applies, all that sort of stuff.
So you're saying that a pool house that does not have a cooking facility
And a
or
bathroom.
a bathroom, we could amend our zoning code to allow that to become an ADU?
But that already occurs. Amend it to reconstruct it into an ADU, add a kitchen, et cetera. That you can already do that. We're talking about amending the zoning code to allow someone to rent out that space for longer than 30 days.
Without a
So-
toilet?
Well,
I
wait,
guess
wait,
you could
wait.
go inside.
Correct me if.
Okay, so I think the issue is we have a lot of ADUs and guest houses on the same property or a pool house. And that pool house may have a kitchen and bathroom and living facilities, right? But right now our code only says you can rent one ADU and you can't separately rent the pool house or the guest house.
Well, that,
So-
if it-
No,
if it's
to eliminate-
ADU, it's two different
No.
policies in there.
Right.
Actually-
Okay, so.
Actually, I think our
separately,
code,
You could just have built a guest house on your property and not call it an ADU. It's limited to the 30-day limitation.
yeah, I think the way, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think the way the code reads, it doesn't specifically address ADUs. It says guest houses and pool houses, if they are rented, cannot be rented for more than 30 days.
Yeah.
And
We
I
need to
think,
change
so
that.
it does, the issue of ADUs has kind of come up as the state law has changed. And we are adjusting to that, but this is one of those items in our ordinances that we haven't changed. And so technically, if you just read it, it would apply to ADUs because it just says guest houses and pool houses can't be rented for more than 30 days. And I mean, I think occupied, maybe it says occupied.
It's
Yeah,
occupied.
That's okay.
Yeah, it's occupied.
But to be
But
clear,
I-
you're not saying that we're going to allow people to rent places for rent without a bathroom and kitchen. That's not what we're saying.
Right.
Okay.
That's where the building code comes in and.
Yeah, I agree
think
with
that's
if it's if it's existing, which I think this is referring to, existing and they have an ADU already that they're renting and they have a pool house where somebody's staying at and perhaps not in accordance with the code, I think that that's fine. And we should clear that up because as I mentioned, it's happening already and it has been happening for years.
They has to have
They
a
have a
bathroom and
bathroom
a
in.
kitchen.
So they
You
have to
can't
be
rent
habitable
something
space in
without
order
it.
to qualify.
They take
Yeah.
the
It's just listed as something
Occupied
else.
guest house.
There's a lot of things we got to go through.
Well, if it's a pool house and there's got a pool there, right?
Ooh, oh,
No, what's typical, in my personal experience, I have a guest house that doesn't have a kitchen.
But it has a bathroom.
It has a bathroom. Yes, it does. And it has a shower too. Would you like to know
But
more?
aren't there laws about what you can rent that you have to have a bathroom and you have to have a kitchen and it's
Yeah,
a whole bunch of
that's-
stuff. So you,
that's where we got to flesh out some of these details, but we got to investigate how to go through that
So
process.
I
more
think the direction is we
semantics.
want to do
Yeah,
this.
yeah.
Yeah.
Now, let me just say, the really, I think, critical thing on ADUs for Atherton is that 2 years ago, we changed the code to say that if you build an ADU, the square footage of your ADU doesn't count against the maximum square footage that is authorized on the lot. And we immediately, and you can see it in the numbers, saw in new houses that were built, almost everyone builds an ADU because now that square footage is free. That's a big deal. And George is using that with HCD to try to convince them that their default methodology of calculating the proper numbers of ADUs should be changed because we changed a law. And ever since that law changed, almost every, I mean, the number is 100% in terms of new houses built versus new ADUs and JADUs on those properties. It's a 1-to-1 match. It's 21 for 21 last year. So
And there's a square footage limitation.
there's a square footage limitation for ADUs of 1,200 square feet, which is something we could change if we wanted to.
Builders and building envelope, right? Something like that, yeah.
So, but I'm just saying, when you change policies regarding these kinds of different things on properties, there are impacts. And we've had an impact on an increased number of ADUs. It's 100% happening now.
The next one was creating an inventory of existing pool houses and guest houses. That's an easy one to do. The next major one for council feedback, amend the code to increase the height limit to allow ADUs to be constructed above garages. And this one, as I mentioned at the beginning, may be essentially moot given the changes to state law. That current limitation is now 25 feet. And we are amending our ADU ordinance to address state law. And that's, we have to figure out how we do that with respect to existing structures versus new construction versus setbacks and things like that. But that's where it's got to go anyway. So that's almost a no-brainer as well, because we have to do that based on state law.
Yeah, but my concern is some existing garages are within 10 or less feet to a neighbor's property. And now suddenly with the height going to 25 feet without additional screening or without some sort of requirement that with a better setback, it's allowed on setbacks, I think that could become a problem. So
Right, that needs to be vetted out as part of the approval process of the ordinance.
I think the screening issue is one we should address, but I also want to point out that this is the kind of ADU that we want to build because you're not taking up more grass. We're not building compounds. We're simply going above what's already there. And there was one resident at one of our meetings talked about adding ability to make an exception for an outdoor staircase. So there are some things that we need to define about how we do it, but I think this is the kind of ADU that would really be great in terms of keeping the nature of our town. So you're not building whole new buildings.
So the next one, yeah, we actually have to make that change based on state law. Yeah. The next one, amend the zoning code to allow 2 ADUs to be constructed on a property.
Okay, so I just read what Portola Valley has done on this. They've recently had a change, and their ordinance now reads that you can only have 1 ADU if you're less than 3.5 acres, and if you're more than 3.5 acres, you can have 2 ADUs. So I'm not advocating that, I'm just bringing that up. So with the idea that if we want to allow a second ADU, I mean, we of course could do it for whatever the property size is, or we could say it only applies if there's an acre or more, or an acre and a half or more, or 3.5 acres or more.
Yeah.
I think it's a reasonable thing to require, not to allow ADUs on every single property, because we have plenty of properties that are 1/3 of an acre.
Yeah, I
It-
think,
it-
I'm not necessarily in favor of 2 ADUs, so now suddenly we're a big rental area. However, if it's an existing structure such as a pool house that has been converted already, or just needs to add a kitchen, and somebody's already staying there, and they already have an ADU, that should be grandfathered in. But and maybe if it's a 2-acre lot and they're properly separated, so they're not both up against the fence to one neighbor, then that would, that is more acceptable too. But I could see, on whatever size property, somebody builds 2 ADUs that were right next door to each other, and one neighbor has to deal with all that rental.
Yeah, but we don't want to get into the weeds on that. The issue is, are we going to allow 2 ADUs on acre lots? And the zoning and the procedures we put in place will make sure that what you suggested doesn't happen.
Yeah, but you're asking my vote for it before we do that.
Yeah, I would recommend that we do have a size limit to add a second ADU. And yet the majority of our lots are in the 1 acre range. I mean, there are a number of lots that have been assembled recently that, increase that substantially. But a 2 acre, 2.5 acre, something like that.
Yeah.
Just
Barbara,
to
do
be
you have a
clear, are
comment?
you saying more free
You-
houses, or just saying you
She's
can make
saying
more than
allow
one
a
on it?
second ADU if it's 2 or more acres, or.
But
Yeah, but
and you
just
also
to
do
be
not have to
clear-
give the square footage exemption for that second ADU.
Right.
That could be also
It has
part
to
of
be
the.
part of the house. That's a separate question. So can you answer that one?
I'm saying the exempt square footage. Currently, if you build an ADU, you get to exempt 1,200 square feet if it's that size. You don't have to do that for the second ADU in terms of the code development. But as
Right.
Councilmember Polito mentions, there's a lot of things we can work out as we go along. If the council conceptually supports 2 ADUs allowed per
The
property.
buildable space, allowed square footage gets greater as the size of the lot gets greater. Right, so
No, I love
So
the size limit. I'm just wondering if we're
that kind of
proposing,
supports Elizabeth's.
Barbara?
I like the size limit, but I worry that wanted to make sure that we weren't saying we're giving more, because right now that's above the buildable. I now can get a new free ADU. We're not saying now you can get a second free ADU, are we?
Lot size is big.
Okay.
Well, no, it doesn't have to be free, though. It doesn't have to be free square footage.
Right.
It can be part of the buildable square footage.
Right.
Well, that's a big question. That right there is a big thing.
But I
It's
think
not
that for
small.
if we were to say you could have a second ADU if you're 2 acres or more, but one of them doesn't get free square footage, it's less relevant once you're 2 acres or more, because the amount of square footage you
That you're
get
allowed. Okay.
has gone up as the lot size goes up.
I was just going to add that we recently discovered that HCD put out a new interpretation of ADU law, I guess last July, but they apparently didn't tell anybody about it till recently, which now asserts that everybody's entitled to 2 ADUs in their property, one within the interior of the existing home, and then one 800 square foot detached ADU plus a JADU within the existing home. So HCD's new interpretation,
Wow.
which we just discovered this because they wrote a letter to one of our clients. And then we discovered this handbook guidebook. Anyway, so their interpretation, anyway, I'm just telling you what their interpretation is, but you might want to consider that when you're considering this 2 ADU question. Because in some ways, if one's within the existing home and then the others
Are you saying
that may be,
two ADUs and a junior ADU?
yes, that's what they're now saying.
Where's that come from?
They've just
Wow.
recently come up with that.
Well, that, you said that that was their interpretation.
I
Perhaps
did.
we'll interpret it differently.
And they had a completely different interpretation about a year and a half before that. So I just,
We're not
since you were
gonna become
talking about it, I wanted to mention this. It might be something you want to consider.
We already have.
Yeah, and I think the reason for including the 2 ADUs per property is to kind of resolve this. You can rent a guest house and your ADU and not have that confusion, and then also to justify the increased production. And I looked at Portola Valleys really quick. Their projected ADU development is a total of 92 units. They have 28 very low, 28 low, 28 moderate, 8 above moderate. So their numbers are much lower than we're looking at.
Well, but their properties are less also. But their resident, the number of residents in Portola Valley is, I don't know, slightly over half. I mean, they're like 4/7 of us.
Yeah.
Well, I would support what Elizabeth said, 2 ADUs on 2 acres or more.
She said
But
2.5.
I do have a
but
question
that's
that
fine.
Bill has raised, which is, well, what if somebody has a guest house or pool house and they're 1 acre and can,
If they're already there,
if it's an existing?
yeah, if it's already there, you grandfather it in. We're talking about new. Well, I think that's where we're gonna be. I can't see taking something away from somebody where they're already doing it.
Well, we want to encourage more of them, so.
Yeah, so if they're already there and they're already doing it, they're already renting it. And they're already having people stay for more than 30 days in the pool house. I can't see, we're gonna pass a law that, again, people won't be following. They're already not following it. Let's go ahead and make it clean and just say it's prohibited from moving forward.
That's all part of the development as we go to the line. So the council's input's important. The next one was allowing them to rent 2 ADUs on their property.
Well, I prefer not, but.
Let them build two.
I think.
Right,
Yeah, obviously, if they build them, they rent them.
right. Okay, and then I believe the next one is amend the fee resolution to remove the planning review fee for ADUs.
Yes, and,
Okay.
and have a impact fee on new home
That is,
development.
that's the
Like
last
I'm
bullet
reading
point
in
there.
the paper, and I've read that in many cities, it's a substantial fee.
You'd have to conduct a nexus study and set the fee according to that analysis in the nexus study.
But this is a nexus study that looks at what?
It looks at what is the affordable housing needs created by the creation of new market rate housing. Basically, a new market rate unit goes in and it creates the need for people to provide services that people, and, including people who care for the property, et cetera, and those people are traditionally lower income. So every time you add a new unit of market rate, it creates a demand for more lower income households to provide services and support to those units.
Okay, but so I maybe I'm just don't understand. But what I'm assuming is if we agree to create an affordable housing impact fee, it's like we say, okay, 5% or 2% of the cost of new housing is a fee that somebody has to pay. And that amount that gets paid then goes into a fund.
Correct.
that is an impact fee fund that then will get used for various things. So
Correct.
for
But-
example,
Affordable housing.
no, it would be used for affordable housing, but there, and I'm sure there's some requirements. But
The
like I'm
setting-
thinking about Menlo College, and Menlo College builds a 60-unit building that has got the affordable housing required in it. And one issue that we were struggling with the college was, well, what if they don't have enough people to rent those rooms, which a developer is going to require a return to build it? Then how do you, one issue you might be able to address with this fee is to use that to cover some of that cost.
That's quite possible. And I think that the point I'm trying to make is irrespective of that, when you set a fee that's basically saying that we are going to use this money, the setting of the fee has to be done according to a study that creates a nexus between the amount of development that is being proposed and the number of lower income jobs that are created in support of that or would be required. For example, dry cleaners. Somebody somewhere is going to need to go to the dry cleaners based on this new unit. So there's a massive calculation that's done through a modeling program that basically comes up, what is that number? And then calculates a fee based on the direct connection between the new unit provided and the need for affordable housing. That's what's required by law.
I understand that. So we pay somebody like you to do that study. Well, I don't care who, I don't care, we pay a professional, I don't care who it is. Is there any reason that we shouldn't do this? I don't think.
It's a
all
good
right,
idea.
Then we're in favor.
We also talked about the idea of right now, when if you have a property in Atherton that you want to subdivide, that it requires a certain amount of frontage on the road. It must be a minimum of 1 acre, but if you, for example, have a property that's 2.5 acres and you divide it, but it's not 175 feet, right, on the road for each of those properties, then you can't subdivide it.
Well, not necessarily the road, it's just the width and the depth of the lot that's created.
I see.
So it can be a flag lot that, you know. is back of
So,
the back.
yeah,
An acre,
Yes.
right, I understand, a real acre.
a real acre.
I only raise it because I was asked about it, and I know the property next door to me, maybe it's not this frontage then on the
Correct,
road, because the
correct.
frontage on the road is the width of a driveway.
Correct. So it's the depth and the width of the lot. There's minimums within the subdivision, the 1 acre minimum and 175 and 200 for depth. And that's at, 0 to 19% slope or something like that, cross slope.
So I raise it because if we were to change the minimum depth and width, but not change the minimum 1 acre, which I'm not proposing, it would enable some additional subdivisions, which right now they may not be able to do because the width wouldn't be whatever, 175 or the depth 200. And if we get additional subdivisions, then for one property, we get net 3 new housing units, which obviously counts towards our housing element.
Or one thing we could do is make that an appealable process to the planning commission, requesting a variance, because I understand it right now, that's not something that they could get a variance on, but if we so deem it, we can.
Well, they could apply for a variance now, but they'd have to make the findings, and I think that would be a little difficult on a flat lot.
Well-
That there's some reason that they need to make the findings for the variance. So I wouldn't make it appealable to the planning commission. I would set a standard, and
Yeah.
that's what everybody has.
Because you never know who's going to be on planning commission. at any one point in time, okay? And so you really need to kind of create something that is gonna stand the test of time as part of our zoning code. Now, I'm a little confused. I heard you say that it doesn't matter about the width on the street. It has to be a certain width.
Yeah, the lot needs to be a certain width. And as George is indicating, we have flag lots. So it's not necessarily the street frontage, but there is the minimum lot width.
Because the street could just be the width of the driveway.
Even though if you have a 2 acres site and you cut it down the middle and 1/2 conforms with the lot width requirement and the other is a few feet short because
Then that's not going to work.
it's not
Right.
going to work.
Correct.
Okay.
Well, and in
And so,
fact, you have 2.5 acre lots that could be split down the middle.
uh-huh,
And neither of them would have the required width
Right.
because they were deep enough to constitute the
Mhm.
whatever, 1.25
so I
acres.
guess what we're asking, right?
Yeah.
Is that be adjusted to give flexibility. And by doing that throughout the town, you probably will pick up more 1 acre lots that would then result in 3 more housing units.
You'd end up with some more development than
No
we
doubt.
currently
Yeah.
have.
Yeah, but they would
Yes.
not be affordable.
They're not affordable.
Doesn't matter. Yeah,
This
no.
is just
I-
one lot.
yeah.
Are
Diana?
are you trying to address abnormally shaped things? Or are you changing the size of what the minimum size could be?
That, I'd like a recommendation from staff on it, but I think basically it changes the minimum depth and width without changing the minimum 1 acre.
Okay, so it's
Yeah,
it's the shape you're
it's
talking
the
about,
shape.
not the absolute. So it would accommodate something that's not a normal shape property.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Or even if you have what looks like a square, big square and just because.
And so we could add that in as another
I think
policy
that's-
investigation.
I think
down
that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, I think it was one of the very first items that was tossed out.
there. Yes, back in February.
Way back when.
Remember that. God, how silly.
Thank you, Lisa. And so that concludes the bullet points, and now you're back to 23 Oakwood.
So does
Well,
that-
I think the lot split.
No, does that conclude the ADU discussion?
Oh, did you want to go back to the Gilmore House?
Well, no, we have, but I want to first confirm that would conclude our ADU discussion.
Yeah,
Yes,
I guess the only question is, do you want to make any changes to the number of units? we're
yes,
assuming?
I think I heard consensus that it was going to be the 40% in the very low and low. Yeah, correct.
But keep the total production.
Yes,
Yeah, same total production, right? So the next thing on my list is lot splits, SB 9.
so yes, so HCD in our letter said that we had overestimated the SB 9 lot splits. I think we had a number of like 96 or something like that. And they said that they don't accept trends and we need to identify the exact lots that are going to be proposed for SB 9 lot splits. And I absolutely agree with that. So we have currently about 6 or so properties that are at some stage in the process of review for an SB 9 application. And there's another 6 that have an interest, that have expressed an interest by calling in and saying, how does this process work? So what we did is took the 6 and multiplied by 8 and got to the 48, and that's what we came up with. We can certainly reduce that, but
Sounds
Okay.
reasonable.
okay. And then,
Yeah, okay, we're good with 48. I mean, I
Okay.
think given that we have 6 properties that have applied and we're looking over 8 years, 48 is as good number
Right.
as anything.
and our estimation is those would all be in the above moderate category. They could end up being lower if somebody split and put 2 800 square foot ADUs on there, but
Actually,
know.
the SB 9 thing is just a ridiculous law and people don't really understand it.
They
I
don't.
mean,
it's got its challenges.
I
I
just,
actually would say that given that we've had 6 applications, that we're then saying 6 times 8, but in fact, each of those 6 would be split into 2 lots. So in fact, there's going to be more than 48. I think 48 is a conservative number. And in fact, if people,
Right.
oh, it's a net addition, it's
Yeah.
48, but it doesn't take into account ADUs. And almost every one of those will build an ADU if they build, because it's free square footage.
Right.
So I think it's a conservative number.
And then I think you're back to the Gilmore House in 23 Oakwood.
Yeah. So Gilmore House.
Where are we again with all the numbers? Sorry, I can't track this with all the changes.
We're balanced.
We're a balance right now. So we could make a policy decision right now to say that we're only going to do multi-dwelling, not in private residence, but on these public, the other things that are zoned, the schools,
Well, that's private, but yeah, on school property,
the school, but it's not zoned the same as a house. It has its own.
right? It's not single family
its own set of
residence.
initials.
We're not doing any multifamily on single family residence if we choose not to do 23 Oakwood.
So we could make that policy decision right now and still have enough numbers. And do you
Based
guys
on-
feel confident, our planning people over here, that we could do something like that? Because that would be a real big breakthrough for a city.
I mean,
They're shaking their heads.
it's just
Okay.
not much of a change than what we've already submitted.
Right. Because
That we
we're
already
still
got.
reliant upon ADUs.
Okay.
And we don't have really a buffer to speak of, so that
Right.
the minute one site that we've said, oh, is gonna have X number of affordable units, we suddenly don't have that, we have to find another site or rezone.
Right.
And that process could happen a lot faster. And then the whole point of having a buffer is that you forestall that for at least a few years.
Then we should talk about the Gilmore.
Well, wait.
What is our buffer, by the way? Can we talk about, that was a good point, because someone brought that up to me about
There's no buffer on the very low and low. What wasn't originally, now there is a 4-unit buffer with the changes that have been discussed.
But of our overall buffers, they recommended a certain number, because I remember at the beginning of this conversation, they recommended a certain number. And one of our very first decisions was to say that was way too much. And it's been brought to my attention that other cities have even lower disregard for what they said we should have. So can we talk about that for a minute? So I understand where we are with what we're doing it versus what they recommended. And is there wiggle room that we do less?
There is a general consensus that and this is what HCD recommended, was a 15 to 30% buffer.
15 to 30?
Yes, and
In each category.
in each category.
In each category.
And unfortunately, most jurisdictions don't get that. They end up, because of how much above moderate income housing does get built, the buffer overall may be 50%, but the low and very low is, because of how they're distributed, is often very thinly on the margin. If the jurisdictions that I'm working with right now have buffers on the order of, for very low and low combined, somewhere around 20%. Some are a little higher than that. None are really any lower than that, because of the concern. The minute you get one project that wipes out, goes for above moderate and doesn't include the very low or low, you're going to wipe out the buffer and immediately have to find a new site or rezone for more housing.
Well, from my looking at the numbers, our buffer is 20%, but on low and very low, it's 0.
Yeah,
I mean, it's 4 units, but
Yeah,
it's
4 units,
essentially
yeah.
0.
So it sounds like we need to look at the Gilmore.
The
House.
way to look at that is anytime, if a development comes in, let's say, that has on sites that you've identified will become very low or low, and it eats into one of the units of the 150 units, you're already at a loss and you have to go back and find something. Well, they don't have to go. Yes. Only if you go below 148. No, you're right. I'm sorry. If they go below 148, if there's no capacity for 148 after your first project, if there is such a thing, then you would end up having to find a new site or a series of sites or rezone.
And I'm assuming it's going to be very, very difficult to analyze that with the town using ADUs as its compliance methodology, but
I mean, we're Atherton, you know, it's the most expensive property in the United States. And when property costs as much as our properties cost, if somebody has to buy the property to develop affordable housing, it's not going to be affordable. So that's why we're stuck with ADUs and with school property, because those don't have to be transferred. And the only dry powder we have here is Bay Road and 23 Oakwood. And the reality is the number of very low and very low that would come from any development on those properties. I mean, we're there, it's absolutely negligible. And the only way we get to 6 properties on 23 Oakwood is we use this funny number that HCD has said, if you use it, then you can count low and very low, but we know it's not real. So
That's not quite true. If we look at the brownstone numbers that Tom put together,
well,
and of course,
well,
he
there's-
just left, but
there is some additional adjustment, and that would also probably include using the park.
Yes, can we talk about the using the park and what the feasibility of that and what the zoning is, the rights for that and some of there's a lot of discussion around that one. But that one, we could potentially, since we have the property, could be 100% low income and could get us to the numbers where we want to be without touching private
I
property.
think it could be low
No,
income.
but to be
Absolutely.
100% low income, you have to have
We'd have to
the
get funding.
development fees.
We would have to get, well, we'd have to get the fees that we're gonna
20 per
propose that we're
acre.
getting from the houses, the single families.
it would qualify for the plan.
Say again, Lisa.
Oh, just that it would qualify for other subsidies. So you could get some tax credits or some other financing.
Because of the park, because of the public park.
No, because of the affordability. There's other financing sources available.
Yeah.
I
we-
went to a
I
whole
cannot
seminar on
even
this.
begin to imagine affordable housing on the park.
I'm sorry?
I can't imagine affordable housing on the park. Very low, very low.
work on your imagination.
I just,
That's the truth.
Well, I could
I
see
know
us
I'm-
building something that if, let's just talk about it for a second. It's on that street. You can, it's the section of the Gilmore House is not currently being used as park property. It's already a house. It's a single house. So what if you were to take that thing, carve it out so that it's more delineated, separate from the park, get its own entrance off of Watkins? We own the property. We then get a nonprofit developer to develop the profit. We're leasing the land to a nonprofit developer. We then could apply for other sources that have been brought to our attention of funding that might be available to us. And there's like $1 million that we've already been hearing about before. So there's other ways we could do that. And since we own the property, we're just leasing it. We do like a 75-year lease to a nonprofit developer. Now,
Workforce housing,
workforce housing, yes, but thank you very much.
senior housing.
Senior housing, all of those could happen there, would be great.
senior housing, I can see. I can't see.
Let me-
workforce housing.
Let me just state what I see as the problem with that.
Okay.
Because I see 3 problems. Number one, just like everywhere else in Atherton, we've talked about putting multifamily housing. Anybody who lives near that is going to object to it. And we're going to get a very large number of responses from residents who don't want it. That's number one. We just know that's going to be the case because it's
Priority
not-
on, yeah.
it's not
Right.
part of what our town is. That's number one. Number two, the costs would have to include building a bridge across the channel.
No.
So there's an added, not
No.
insignificant cost. And number three, there's a reversionary clause in the deed that granted the park to Atherton, which essentially says that if it's used for housing, that the park goes to Stanford University. And it explicitly says that it can't be used for housing. Now, we have ignored that for 50 years because somebody gave us a house that we put on the property, and either the city manager or the chief of police have essentially lived in that house since it's been there, and that's considered de minimis. And yes, no, the house was moved to the park. And the real issue isn't real, I mean, we can say it's de minimis, but let me just give the legal thought. The real issue is nobody sued us. And if somebody sued us, then this issue would be tested. But I can say it's de minimis, but as soon as we put a 6 or 10 unit townhouse in there, the likelihood of some neighbor suing us, or, I mean, I think it's less likely that Stanford would sue us, but there's a risk. And I don't know how much the risk is, but there's some risk. It's not a risk I want to take.
One of the things some of these housing developers do is if especially anywhere near a park, they will figure out a thing that we want, whether it's, I won't say pickleball court or pool, but if they have a specific thing that the city wants, that will be rolled into it, and then they would fund that on our land as part of that development. That's happened in a lot of other areas where they carved out a little park to be a park. Of course, we don't want to carve out park for a park, but you get the idea. So there's ways to make it of a public benefit beyond the fact that we have, housing, workforce housing for people in our city.
Well, I'd like to have the city attorney actually give us an opinion, maybe not tonight, but before the end of January, as to, since we're just putting potentially, in this case, it would be residential housing where residential housing already exists, if that's a problem. She's already told us about the will is enforced for 99 years post bequeathment. But since there's already a house there, maybe that qualifies, and the house has been there for a substantial amount of time. There's got to be, hopefully there's some approval. Now, I'm not advocating necessarily doing that, and if we were to do it, I would, if the rest of the council wants to go do it, it would have to be not only a bridge, but cordoned off from the park, since the park, is closed at sunset. And if we didn't cordon it off, then it may or may not be closed at sunset. So I realize that it's an interesting proposition. And, of course, doing it, then we would have to get all those 6 units in that area. But then, as George and others have said, well, if we fall short on one, or in our reporting, we're not making our numbers. I still think that, not to jump the gun, but I think doing something else somewhere is still in our best interest. The rest of you may not agree. I'm not interested in putting 26 units per acre on Oakwood, but I think a smaller zoning with a discussion with the owner, who has told us he wants to build, which is not what any of these other people have told us. They said they would like to build, but they haven't said they want to build, and they're ready to go forward, I think is something that we should not ignore. And but it can't be overdone. But there's never been a discussion. Perhaps planning or the city manager could have that discussion with the owner as to, get a handshake agreement with regards to having a few units being designated, perhaps using the density bonus to be guaranteed to be affordable. So anyway, that's my 2 cents on both of these. I'm willing to go forward with either or none or whatever, but I'm concerned about making our numbers. I'm concerned about our first audit, and I'm concerned about getting this thing actually approved. Because we don't want to be in a position where it's not approved and it continues to move forward. But I am not interested, I'll say again, with overcrowding Oakwood if we do choose to build there and making it that area uninhabitable for the people who already are. Anyway, that's my comment.
I'd like to make one more pitch for the Gilmore House. It is the only property that the city owns. It shows very good will that we're willing to put some skin in the game in terms of addressing this issue that's coming out from the state. It would then put us 100% in with the fair housing and all the other requirements that we're trying to get around. So I'd be curious what your guys' view on that property is.
Yeah, I think it's great. I mean, I can't opinion on the legality that Mona would need to research, but having town control is substantial. And to your point, the land value would be then zero. A developer could just come in, a nonprofit, right? And do it. You could do a land lease for $1 a year.
And we could also subject to all of our design criteria to make it pleasing and nice.
Go ahead.
So are you trying to put this, give direction to staff to add the Gilmore House into this, this submission right now? Because I don't think you've done enough work to do that, have you?
Well, we could certainly add a number of, 6 to 10 units or something like that within the very low and low category as the Gilmore House opportunity.
And if we did that, I think well, I actually asked people who know more than me, but it seems like then we're showing good faith that we're actually doing what we're supposed to be doing. It would check off a whole bunch of those things and we don't have to, and again, all of these things have to go through all this other evaluation anyway. So maybe when we go through all the other evaluations, it'll be thrown out, but it shows such good faith that we're doing what we're supposed to be doing without having people coming with pitchforks, you know?
I agree 100%. And if legal, we get into a legal quagmire and we can't go forward, then we make an adjustment. But it would definitely make our numbers look.
Yeah, so I guess I am asking that we consider putting that on the list this round as opposed to waiting for later for all the reasons I just said. Now we're making a policy decision that all we're going to do, we are doing rezoning, thank you very much, but we're doing it not on private property. We're doing it on either schools or our own property. So it's again from a guiding principle as opposed to spot approach.
So just because we do it doesn't mean that we actually have to build it. Yes, and
Well, that's the
Unfortunately, no.
difference. It's our.
That's different. If we put it in there, we're going to end up having to do it within the next 8
Yeah.
years.
They'll demand a schedule.
Schedule it,
They'll
timeline.
demand that the program include a schedule for when you'll request proposals.
And,
Right.
Yeah.
well, I think that we should
Also, oh, I'm sorry.
go ahead.
I was talking to Lisa. For the site to qualify, it would need to accommodate at least 16 units and would have to be zoned at 20 units an acre, which would allow the property to have 18 or 19 units.
It's
So
big
if-
enough.
Yeah, so if you were going to designate it, you'd need to,
It's at least 0.8 to 0.9 acres.
yeah, you'd need to indicate at least 16 units there and 20 units an acre.
So to do that, then you would have to take more land from the park. Is that not correct?
No, to make it a full acre, you would, but it's currently about 0.8, 0.9 acres.
Yeah, it doesn't need to be a full
gonna vote
acre.
no.
It just needs to accommodate 16 units.
Yeah, it's got to be, if it gets approved by and recommended by Mona, it's got to be like for like to keep from getting out of any issues, I think.
Is there a reason
That's
why
my
we're not
2 cents.
asking Mona for this?
Put your-
That's not like.
yeah.
Your mic,
Put
yeah,
your
put your
phone
mic on.
Yeah, but if what we're being told is we have to zone it at 20 an acre, that's 16 units. 16 townhouses is 100% different than 1 3-bedroom, single-family residence. It's exactly why Oakwood residents don't want the townhouses in Oakwood, or why Atherton Avenue residents don't want the townhouses on Atherton Avenue, or you can go to any other location. It's totally different than a single-family residence.
Right.
No, but that's not what you meant, Bill. I think you were talking about acreage, right?
Yeah, it's like for the space that they're building on. You can't take more of the park or you'll be in trouble, I think.
Well, I think that George had calculated that and reduced the number and they calculated that at 0.8 acre, which is the existing footprint of that like for like. But I have a problem with it. I think if it were like for senior housing, for our, residents, And that certainly would not be inclusionary, I guess. It'd be exclusionary. But I think that just making that decision here, it hasn't been vetted at all with any of the other residents along Watkins, and Watkins is a very busy street already. And there's no kind of, I think, public transit. I guess you can walk to the train pretty easily, but yeah, pretty easily.
But can I ask a question? Because maybe I've got an assumption that's wrong, which is I've been assuming that the Point Acre we call the Gilmore House is really part of the park. Maybe it's not part of the park. Is it zoned differently than the park?
It's
If it's
not.
part of the park, then it's subject to the deed that gave us the park.
So
If it's not part of the park, then that's a different issue. And I've been assuming that it's just part of the 22-acre park.
it is part of the 22-acre park. It's not a separate parcel. However, the city attorney has advised that it is the sole portion of the park that is currently used for housing. So if the town were to do additional legal research or analysis and determine that it's used for housing, it could still be used for housing. It's like for like transition for housing, then it could be something the council could consider. And the city attorney's on the line there now visible. Mona, do you have anything further to say on that?
That accurately captures my interpretation of it. I think that if what we are proposing to do is incidental to existing buildings and does not take over active park space, I think we would be in line with the restrictions in the deed.
And just to clarify, would you say that as long as you don't move past the current footprint of the Gilmore House property, I don't know how you know what the end of that property is since it's all in the park, but as long as you don't move past what we've identified as approximately 0.8 acres, you can put as much housing on that as you want, and that wouldn't change the character, wouldn't cause the reversionary clause to come forward in the deed?
So there's not a crystal clear answer to that because the language of the deed and the underlying purpose and intent is to keep the park space for park and recreational purposes. However, because there is that carve out language for incidental uses and kind of acknowledges some of the existing buildings, I think that there is a reasonable and good faith argument that as long as we are not, converting the open space or park land for housing that does not already entail housing on it, that we are complying with the terms and conditions in the deed. So again, this is I think, reasonable interpretation that would allow us to do that, but there is no bright line test that we can say we are in compliance with.
And the house is fenced to a significant degree and does its area is pretty cleanly designated from the park. Yeah.
Is the backyard fence right on the property line? Because as you know, some of those fences around there don't.
Backyard is fenced all the way to the, I think it's Lane Gate. There's cyclone fencing.
16 units at the backyard of an adjacent property owner
Yeah, right.
without, talking to them.
That's why I said 6.
But in order to get that inclusion or the low income, I don't know. I'm not ready to pull that trigger.
But ultimately, there's going to come a time when one of those decisions is going to have to be made and somebody's going to be upset. I don't care where it is in town. And how many letters do we get on Bear Gulch in like 48 hours? It doesn't matter where you do it. At some point, Elizabeth, you are going to have to make a tough decision.
This is also the only place where it's feasible to get the low income category. There's no other places feasible unless you own land.
Okay, so we're coming to 3 hours. We're gonna make a decision right now on the Gilmore House, and then we're gonna address 23 Oakwood, and then we're gonna adjourn the meeting. What do people want to do on the Gilmore House? I think Bob and Diana want to go with their 16, whatever, 20 per acre, 16 units. I don't know what, I'm opposed to it.
I'm not in favor of 16 units. 6 is acceptable, I think, but I just want the 16.
I don't think 6 is,
Worth the trouble.
exactly. And 16, it would really change the character. And I think it would be very difficult to design 16 units on 0.8 acres, including parking and garages and outdoor area and fencing and ingress, egress. And I think it would be a disaster.
So if you guys don't want that, where are you getting your low income housing?
Well,
We don't know.
we haven't finished a discussion.
We've got it in the plan right now. I think it's reasonable in the plan. The problem with what we have is that if something falls through, we got to come up with an alternative. That's the requirement.
I still think the Gilmore House that there's potential there, but I think it needs a little more vetting. I don't think we should add it right now. So that
So keep
leaves
it for
Diana.
the backup to keep it as a backup.
No,
Well, it's
I feel the
definitely-
same way about it as I do exploring locations for multifamily. We should be working on it in case we get to
Mhm,
a hard place.
mhm. Yeah.
But we've done virtually no, we've done nothing on this. I mean, I'd at least like to walk the property and see where the neighbors are and get some idea of visually what we do, whether we would do the brownstone concept or a 3-story building or what we would do. I don't know. Anyway, I can't support it at this point, so I think it fails.
Okay, so. Yeah, I can tell you, I've walked the property. I know exactly. It goes right up to the house on Lane Place. It's right on their backyard. And it goes up, and there's a cyclone fence. It goes up to the little area around the North Meadow. It's 0.8 acres. It's like a normal Atherton property, basically.
Yeah.
Then you're on to 23 Oakwood, and the chart on your screen reflects 0 at 23 Oakwood. So the discussion from there is left off from where you were before.
I think that's the right answer.
Okay. You do.
I do, but
23 Oakwood.
23 Oakwood, this is saying, taking 23 Oakwood off.
So all of our low income then, our Menlo College,
At 30.
Menlo School,
At 10.
and ADUs.
At 112, and that totals 152. Over 148 required.
And the ADU number is relatively conservative. It's 40% versus what ABAG and other communities have used at 60%. And that doesn't mean that it's going to hold up, but it is what it is. It's still conservative relative to the 60%, but that's where the real risk is, I think.
And I think we should just keep thinking about other opportunities. You know, this isn't the end of it all. We really, really do need to think.
We know it's not the end. It's a marathon and we're just beginning.
Yeah.
But I don't know what other there probably will be another property that comes up because last May, these properties came out of the air and
Yeah.
that created a big
Tell you.
reaction. And just this last month, Bear Gulch property came out of the air and that created a reaction. I don't know what else is
Well,
something's gonna come up, probably a property next to me.
What I'd like to see us do is approach this whole process in a different way, where we set a set of principles by which we're working on. So instead of waiting for properties we should have a set of rules. So it sounds today like we made a rule without him saying it, is that we don't have any on private properties other than ADUs. So there should be rules if we go forward and we have to add more, is where's it gonna be? Should it be on near mass transit? Should it be on streets that have enough capacity to hold the cars? There's a set of criteria that we could set that allows us to guide it going forward, so we're not being hit by popping up and getting all the neighbors mad when all of a sudden they get something. And then we would be able to say to them, the only reason this is on here is because it meets the criteria we established as a council.
So Diane, I remember in the very, very beginning, you and I went out, we were assigned to do this, and we went out and we created our 7 guiding principles. And that's what we did. And we submitted it to city manager and town council with things. But I think and that was good because we did exactly that, but it did take neighborhoods into consideration. And we also need to have the public outreach and educate our residents about it. This is not what we really want to do. We didn't come up with this. We're not enjoying this process. It's being shoved down our throats. And we appreciate the input from our residents and spending 3 hours of their time sitting here listening to us debate and trying to figure out how we can approach this without putting the town at risk for unintended, lawsuits and builders remedies and, the HCD taking away our rights. Yeah. So
I just want to add to that because I think it's true. This is a very difficult, cumbersome, and undesired process that we're forced into. In addition to thanking the residents for spending the amount of time that they've spent on this, which is really very significant. We all know we've gotten a lot of letters and some people have spent a lot of time on this, both, and they're doing it to protect their own quality of life. But also our staff has worked really hard on this, and our staff is an easy target for the recommendations that our particularly consulting staff make. And that's unfair because they've worked really hard at this also. And, basically the charge that we all are obligated is to uncover every leaf we can and to try to find what we can do. And I think the staff has honestly approached every opportunity and some have been thrown back in our faces. Yeah. Because some for NIMBY issues, but some just because, some of this property doesn't make sense to develop, right? We saw that and okay, Cal Water reacted, but this was an incredibly remote property. We had originally said on the periphery of town and along busy streets were sort of the priorities.
But what I'm saying, okay, I'm agreeing with what both of you guys are saying 100%. I'm saying something slightly different. We're making a proposal as of tonight. Going next year, we may get rejected. We're going to have to start to review other choices. And I would like to say that if we had those things, I heard someone over in the audience say, well, what were those principles? We should be talking about when we go to our outreach meetings with our citizens, we should be saying, these are the principles by which we're going to decide. And these are the criteria, and get buy-in by them. Because if everyone agrees, well, it's got to be on a big thoroughfare, for an example, or it has to be whatever those criteria, if they've agreed to those, when the next residence or the next thing comes up, it will fit into that. So we will know right off the bat whether we can accept it or not. So instead of waiting for ideas to plop in our lap, one of the things we should do next is say, these are our criteria of how we're going to move forward. And then we will measure everything that comes up before us on these criteria. And that would be fair. That would be an absolutely fair way to do it. And that should be part of our conversation going forward when we meet with the residents. That's what I'm saying.
So one last thing before we adjourn, the chart that you see on the screen there is the final numbers, the final representation as the council directed this evening. That's what we will then bring to the community for our outreach meetings in January. And the format of those meetings was previously suggested to have an individual private residence. The town sends out invites to a large neighborhood and those all come to that private residence. There's been some concerns expressed with that. So the new recommendation is to flip that around and have the private residences do their own invites for those meetings and staff can attend. But then we'll have a series of town hall meetings at public locations, pavilion, town hall, maybe even Menlo College, and have a site there that the whole town can attend if they want to attend. And staff will go to that one as well. But those that have volunteered and raised their hands to participate will still do those meetings at those residences, and staff will come, bring some snacks, and host whatever residents they want to come. Does that work? Okay.
Do we still want to do more or just the ones that have been committed to
So
already?
it's largely going to be Lisa and I, so largely the ones that have committed so far. More neighborhood meetings.
Let
I
me
know
just
it's-
advocate. I think the principal purpose of the distributed meetings is both to share this with a broader group, but really we need to pitch the ADU survey. And I mean, if we're going to get residents to really build ADUs or convert, they're going to spend money. This is a big commitment from our residents to put out real money to convert something or to build something. And it's only going to happen if we go out and we talk about why it's important and just look at our conclusion. The reason that it's important is to avoid having multifamily housing built near you. That's it. And that's a reason to motivate some number of people to spend the money and to rent at affordable rates. Now, how many that is, we're going to have to see, but I think that's the purpose of these distributed meetings.
Agree. Okay. That's all we have. Lisa, do you need anything additional? No.
You have a public comment, though.
From Mr. Arada.
Don, are you still on the line? Do you want to make your comment?
David.
David.
David. Yeah, as a last ditch effort to be on there, I may make one more suggestion. About 100 yards into Redwood City from 23 is a development where they put 6 houses on a lot less than an acre. I ran into a developer a couple months ago who said that he could put 10 single family houses on that property very easily. Now, you have, as moderate, you have ADUs. I can get you 10 real houses if you want to do that. That's all I gotta say.
They're all going to be above moderate income, correct?
Yes. But you still need the moderate ones. You still need.
Yeah. But I think if you come up with a few low income houses, we might jump on board.
Well, you yourself said, how could you do low income houses when the property's worth so much money?
Yeah, but you already own the property.
Oh, yes, yes. And if you went to 20 units an acre, sure. But to build 10 houses and then have 2 of them low, that it's not gonna work. Anyway, that was my thought. I believe Mayor and I briefly discussed that, and he said that it wouldn't be a bad idea. This is several months ago. You know, the council has approved what I was doing like 2 other times. Now I'm out in the cold. I don't understand it, but. Okay.
Yep. Thank you, David.
Yeah.
Okay, motion to adjourn. Thank you, everybody.